The sun beat down on his eyes so fiercely that it felt as if someone were pressing red-hot coins directly into his pupils. Ethan Rice opened his eyes and saw a copper-colored sky. Not blue, not gray, copper. As if someone had stretched a sheet of old tin over the world and set it on fire from below. Sand filled his mouth and crunched between his teeth. He was lying on his back in the middle of an empty service yard off I-15, and for the first 3 seconds, he couldn't remember why he was there. Then he remembered. The caravan was gone. 22 people turned their backs and headed southwest toward the oasis, 40 miles across the open desert at 60 degrees. Donovan said this was their only chance. Ethan looked at the people. Then he looked at the van. Then he said he'd catch up. No one turned around. That was 7 hours ago. Now the temperature had started to drop, which meant he had about 10 hours until dawn. 10 hours to decide whether he would live or die next to a piece of rusty metal on the shoulder of a dead road. The van stood like a monument to a world that no longer existed. A 1998 Ford E350, model year 1998. A cargo passenger van. The white paint had scorched to a grayish-yellow color and was peeling off in patches like skin after a burn. The left front tire had burst, and the rim was buried 4 inches deep in the sand. So was the right rear. The windshield was cracked in a spiderweb pattern from being struck by something heavy. Maybe a rock. Maybe a fist. Ethan walked around the truck and took stock. It was a habit. When the world is on fire, you count what you can count. 4 tires. 2 dead. A 7.3-liter diesel engine, seized, the battery swollen from the heat. The radiator clogged with sand so tightly that the cooling fins had turned into a solid brick. The exhaust system rusted right through. The fuel tank. Ethan tapped it with his knuckles. It didn't sound hollow. There was fuel in there, maybe a quarter of a tank, maybe a third. He tapped it again and listened. About 20 gallons. That would be enough for 100 miles, if the engine would even start. If. He opened the hood. The hinges creaked so loudly that the sound faded into the desert and echoed back from nothing. Ethan looked at the engine and exhaled. The cylinder block was covered in a crust of caked-on sand and oil. The alternator belt had snapped. The cooling system hoses were cracked. The air filter had turned into a solid briquette of sand. Ethan closed his eyes and stood there for 30 seconds. He wasn't praying. He was recalling. The schematic for the 7.3 Power-Stroke engine unfolded in his mind like a drawing on a screen. Every bolt, every hose, every relay. 10 years of working in his father's shop had etched these diagrams into his brain like a tattoo on bone. He opened his eyes and looked at the engine again. Now he didn't see a pile of rusty metal, he saw a system. 214 components. Of those 30, a maximum of 5 are beyond repair. The rest can be fixed, replaced, worked around. Ethan pulled his gloves out of his pocket. Leather, worn white at the fingertips. The left glove was scorched on the palm. 3 years ago, wearing these gloves, he'd pulled a 6-year-old girl from a burning car at the Cajon Pass. The girl survived. The gloves smelled of gasoline and for some reason home. He pulled them on and felt his hands stop trembling. He looked at the van and spoke aloud because there was no one else to talk to. He said they were both written off. Him and this car. And he suggested they see what they could do together. His voice sounded calm. Strangely calm for a man who'd been left to die in the desert. The first thing he did was get some light. You can't work without light. The sun had already set, and the temperature was dropping fast. In an hour, it would be around 0. In 3 hours, it would be below freezing. Ethan found a flashlight in the truck's cab. The batteries were dead. He took the flashlight apart and pulled out the contacts. Then he walked over to the transformer box at the edge of the service yard. The door had been torn off. It was empty inside, but a piece of wire and 2 car batteries were lying on the floor. Both were swollen. Ethan checked them both. The first one was completely dead. The second one showed signs of life, very faint ones. He carried the battery over to the van and connected the LED strip he'd taken from a roadside billboard to it. A dim, bluish light flooded the engine compartment. Ethan nodded. Now he could get to work. He spent the next 4 hours elbow deep inside the engine. The temperature had dropped to -3. His fingers were going numb even with gloves on. He took off his gloves because he couldn't feel the threads through them. He worked with his bare hands until his fingers lost all sensation. Then he'd put the gloves back on for 5 minutes. Then he'd take them off again. First thing he did was pull out the air filter and throw it away. Instead of the filter, he cut a piece of fabric from the backseat upholstery and stretched it over the filter frame in 3 layers. Not ideal, but better than a sand brick. Then he turned his attention to the alternator belt. The broken belt was useless. Ethan searched the service yard. In a corner behind a trash container, he found an old garden hose. He cut off a piece of the right length. The hose was too soft to serve as a belt, but Ethan wrapped it with the wire he'd got in the transformer shed. It looked ugly, but it held. By 3 in the morning, he got to the main problem, a seized cylinder block. The pistons weren't moving. Ethan lay down on the sand under the car and shone a flashlight up from below. The problem wasn't with the pistons. The problem was the oil, or rather, the lack of it. The oil had either evaporated from the heat or leaked out through a crack in the oil pan. The metal had been running without lubrication and had seized up. Ethan lay under the car for half an hour, thinking. Then he crawled out and walked over to the wrecked trailer at the other end of the yard. The trailer belonged to some motorhome. Everything inside had been ransacked. But in the cabinet under the sink stood a partially used bottle of vegetable oil. Ethan took it. Then he found a can of WD-40 in the same spot, with a little left at the bottom. He returned to the van and began pouring oil into each cylinder one at a time. A little at a time, drop by drop. Then he sprayed WD-40 onto the cylinder walls. Then he waited 5 minutes. Then he tried to turn the crankshaft by hand, using a 22mm wrench he found in the glove compartment under the driver's seat. The first 20 attempts yielded nothing. The crankshaft was stuck solid. Ethan didn't give up. Oil. Wait. Wrench. Oil. Wait. Wrench. On the 28th try, he felt movement. Barely noticeable. Maybe half a degree. Maybe it was just his imagination. On the 34th try, the crankshaft shifted 2 degrees. On the 41st, it turned a quarter of a revolution. Ethan sat down in the sand and stared at the engine. His fingers were bleeding. His knuckles were scraped down to the flesh. He told the van it was a stubborn beast. Then he smiled. For the first time in a month. Dawn broke at 5:40. The temperature began to rise immediately. Ethan knew that in 2 hours, it would be impossible to work outside. He poured the remaining vegetable oil into the oil pan. He hooked up the battery. He got behind the wheel. The cab reeked of scorched plastic and mice. The steering wheel was hot even through his gloves. Ethan turned the ignition key. The starter wheezed. The engine jerked once and died. Ethan waited 10 seconds. He turned it again. The starter wheezed longer. The engine jerked twice. Then it died. Ethan closed his eyes. He listened. Not the starter. Not the engine. He listened to what exactly wasn't starting. The sound was wrong. Too restricted. Fuel wasn't getting through. He climbed out of the cab and checked the fuel line. The coarse filter was clogged. Ethan removed it and blew it out with his mouth. Then he removed the fine filter and threw it away. The fuel was now flowing directly without filtration. Dirty. Dangerous for the injectors. But right now he needed just one thing, for the engine to run for at least 10 minutes. He got back behind the wheel. He turned the key. The starter whirred. The engine jerked. Again. Again. And suddenly a cloud of black smoke shot out of the exhaust pipe. A roar filled the desert. Hoarse. Ragged. Choking. But alive. The engine was running. The van shook from stem to stern like an old man awakened after a 20-year slumber. The temperature gauge crept upward. Fast. Too fast. Ethan knew that without a working cooling system, the engine would overheat in 10 minutes. Maybe 15. He shut off the engine. But he was smiling. The engine was alive. The rest could be figured out. He spent the rest of the day in the shade under the van. The temperature outside had climbed past 65. The sand burned through the fabric. Ethan lay there, tracing a diagram of the cooling system in the sand with his finger. The radiator was dead. There was nothing to flush it with. He had 1.5 canisters of water left. That was enough for 3 days' worth of drinking water if he conserved it. He couldn't waste water on flushing the radiator. So he needed another solution. He thought for 2 hours. Then he stopped thinking and started looking around. A service yard, a dumpster, a wrecked trailer from a mobile home, a transformer box, and at the far end of the lot, a refrigerated trailer half buried in sand. Ethan squinted. A refrigerated trailer. A refrigeration unit. He stood up and walked over to it. The trailer was large, 12 meters long. The door was jammed. Ethan found a piece of rebar and pried the lock open. Inside, it was empty and reeked of rot. But he didn't need the trailer. He needed the refrigeration unit on the roof. He climbed up. The unit was there, damaged. The compressor was burned out. But the copper condenser coil was intact. 12 meters of copper tubing twisted into a neat spiral. Ethan looked at it, and something clicked in his head. The copper coil. The night's cold. The engine. He saw the solution in its entirety, like a photograph. The copper tube would become an auxiliary cooling circuit. At night, the temperature drops to -5. The fluid in the circuit cools to nearly 0. During the day, the cold fluid circulates through the engine and draws away heat. Not forever, just for a few hours of driving. But that's enough. He worked all evening and all night. He removed the coil from the refrigerator. He took apart the refrigeration unit's housing and cut out aluminum plates for heat exchange. He found a washing machine hose in the trailer home. He used it as a connecting pipe. The most difficult part was the mounting. The coil had to sit on the roof of the van, open to the night air, and, during the day, connect to the engine's cooling system via a manual valve. He made the valve from a faucet he found in the trailer home. By 4 in the morning, the system was ready. It was ugly. The coil stuck out from the van's roof like a copper crown. The hoses were secured with wire. The faucet jutted out from under the hood. But it worked. Ethan poured the remaining antifreeze from the van's expansion tank into the circuit. He diluted it with water from his canister. He winced with every sip. He opened the valve and waited 2 hours for the night's cold to cool the fluid in the coil. By 6 in the morning, the fluid temperature in the circuit was around 2 degrees. He started the engine. Black smoke. A raspy roar. The temperature gauge crept upward, but more slowly, much slower. 20 minutes later, the gauge stopped just below the red zone. Before, it had reached the red zone in 10 minutes. Ethan watched the gauge and did the math. At that rate of heating, he could drive for about 2 hours before overheating. Then he'd have to stop. 4 hours of waiting for the coil to cool down. Then another 2 hours of driving. 20 miles per cycle, 80 miles a day if he drove at night, when cooling was most efficient. It was 40 miles to Oasis. He could be there by tomorrow morning. The van crawled along I-15 at 30 miles per hour, and each of those miles felt like 10. The left side was pulling to the right because of the different-sized wheels. He had to hold the steering wheel to the left with constant pressure. An hour later, Ethan's right shoulder began to ache. 2 hours later, he could no longer feel his hand. The road was covered with sand, knee-deep in places, and the van sank into the sand at every such spot. Ethan shifted into low gear and stepped on the gas. The old truck roared and fought its way out, every single time. The temperature gauge was in the top third of the scale and was slowly creeping toward the red zone. The copper coil on the roof radiated the cold it had accumulated overnight. Ethan watched the gauge and counted the minutes. He still had 40 minutes before the engine overheated, maybe 50. He saw them at the 23rd mile. At first he thought they were rocks, dark spots on the side of the road. Then one of the spots stirred. Ethan pulled the van over and turned off the engine. The silence of the desert descended immediately. He got out of the cab and walked forward. There were 11 of them. 11 people from his former caravan. They were lying and sitting along the road next to the overturned bus. The bus was buried in sand up to the windows, and its shadow was barely visible. 4 of them weren't moving. Ethan stepped closer and saw that they were simply asleep, or had lost consciousness. The other 7 were looking at him, or rather at the van behind him. Their eyes were like those of people who had already said goodbye to life and suddenly saw something impossible. The woman recognized him first. An Asian woman, thin to the point of transparency. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. She was sitting with her back against the bus wheel, holding an empty bottle on her lap. She said his name, barely audibly. Ethan walked over to her and gave her some water. She drank in small sips because he was holding the bottle and wouldn't let her drink quickly. She asked how he was doing. He said he'd fix the van. She said that was impossible. He said it was. This was Madison Chen, an electrical engineer from Silicon Valley, 27 years old. Before the disaster, she was developing solar panels for a startup in San Jose. 2 days ago, she still had water. Then it ran out. Of those still conscious, she was the closest to death. Ethan went around to all 11 of them. He gave each one some water, just a little, just enough to keep them from dying in the next hour. He had a little more than a canister left. That wouldn't even last a day for 11 people. Donovan wasn't with them. This group had fallen behind the main caravan a day ago. They couldn't go any further. Donovan didn't stop. He said the oasis was 15 miles away and that it was every man for himself. Ethan listened and said nothing. 15 miles, at 60 degrees, without water. For people who can't even stand anymore. It's a death sentence. Donovan knew that. They all knew it. Ethan loaded 4 of them into the van, the ones who couldn't walk. Maddie was among them. The remaining 7 said they'd try to walk alongside the van. Ethan shook his head. He climbed into the bus through a broken window and spent 20 minutes searching the interior. He found 2 pieces of tarpaulin. He found a coil of rope. He found a broken wheelchair. He got out, and in half an hour, assembled a rope and tarps. He tied it to the van's rear bumper with rope. He put 3 more people on the sled. The remaining 4 could walk, as long as they went slowly. He told them to hold on to the side of the van and walk in its shadow. The speed dropped to 5 miles per hour. Ethan drove the old man in first gear and listened to the engine. The temperature was creeping up. The radiator had given off almost all its coolant. He had maybe 30 minutes before it overheated. 20 minutes later, the engine began to knock. A distinctive sound. Ethan knew that knock. Overheating. The metal was expanding. The clearances were closing. Another 5 minutes, and the pistons would seize up again. He cut the engine. It was about 8 miles to the oasis. Desert all around. Not a shadow in sight. The temperature was around 62. The 4 in the van were either asleep or unconscious. 3 were on the flatbed. The 4 of them stood nearby, watching him. Ethan opened the hood. He placed his palm on the cylinder block. He burned himself. He pulled his hand away. He stood there, thinking. He needed to cool down the engine. No water. The radiator was empty. The antifreeze was boiling. He looked at the exhaust pipe, then at the condensation dripping from the copper coil on the roof. Drop by drop. Condensation from the air. The desert is dry, but not completely. The humidity is about 4%. The copper tube is cooler than the surrounding air. Moisture condenses on the metal. Ethan watched the drops and counted. 1 drop every 4 seconds. It was far too little. He needed another source. He crawled under the van, the exhaust system. When a diesel engine is running, there's water vapor in the exhaust. Ethan removed the muffler. He found a piece of plastic tubing on the bus. He slipped it onto the exhaust pipe. He ran the tube upward and bent it so that the condensate would drip into a plastic bottle. A primitive exhaust gas condenser. Not pure water, it was mixed with soot and oxides. But it would do for the cooling system. He waited 2 hours. The engine had cooled down enough. The coil on the roof had picked up a bit of cool air from the shade of the van. Ethan started the engine and drove off. 5 miles per hour. Condensate dripped into the bottle. Every 20 minutes he stopped and poured the collected water into the cooling system. Dirty, murky, but cold. The temperature gauge needle fluctuated between the top third and the red zone. The engine rattled and sputtered. But it didn't stall. 4 miles, 3, 2. Maddie came to her senses in the cab and stared silently ahead. Walls appeared on the horizon. Concrete ones. With towers. An oasis. For the last mile, the engine ran on sheer stubbornness. The temperature gauge shot into the red and froze there. Steam was rising from under the hood. Ethan could hear the metal groaning. He didn't stop. 2 men with rifles were standing at the oasis gate. They were looking at the van with the copper coil on the roof and the wheelchair being dragged behind the rear bumper. One of them said something into his radio. The gate began to open. Ethan cut the engine right in front of the gates. The van coasted another 10 meters or so and came to a stop. The engine made a sound like a deep sigh and fell silent. White steam billowed from under the hood. Donovan was standing behind the gates. He was looking at the van, then at the 11 people climbing out of the cab and unhooking themselves from the tow rope, then back at the van. A murky liquid was dripping from the exhaust pipe. Condensation. Water. Donovan looked at Ethan and asked one word. How? Ethan shrugged and said, "The fridge." They'd been dumped after all. Donovan stood there in silence for 10 seconds. Then he turned and walked away. He never gave orders in front of Ethan again. The oasis occupied the site of a former gas station and an adjoining motel. The walls were made of concrete blocks and sandbags. About 100 people lived inside. A well-provided water, murky water with an iron taste, but it was water. Ethan's first order of business was to give his 11 men a drink. Then he found some shade. Then he fell asleep. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke up, it was already dark. The temperature was -2. He found the old man in the parking lot by the gate. No one had touched him. Ethan inspected the engine by flashlight. The piston rings on 2 cylinders were seized. The cylinder head gasket was blown. Oil had mixed with the coolant. He sat down on the ground next to the van and leaned his back against the front wheel. He told the old man that it had broken down again. Then he said that it was no big deal, that he'd fix it. Then he asked aloud into the void where he'd get a cylinder head gasket for a 1998 engine in a world where there wasn't a single functioning auto parts store. The desert didn't answer. Ethan sat there for another 5 minutes. Then he got up and went to look for Maddie Chen. On the 7th day at the oasis, Ethan finished the engine. The old man started right up. Not perfectly. The 3rd cylinder was misfiring slightly at idle. But the temperature gauge held steady. The coil-type cooling system was working. Maddie had overhauled the alternator, and now it was putting out a steady 14 volts. Ethan stood by the open hood and listened to the engine. The sound was right. A steady hum with a slight rasp. Like the voice of an old man who's smoked a lot but is still going strong. Ethan nodded and closed the hood. He told the old man that it sounded almost decent. Maddie stood nearby, wiping her hands with a rag. She said he was the only person she knew who would compliment an engine and insult it in the same sentence. The problem wasn't the engine. The problem was the people. During his week at the oasis, Ethan realized 3 things. First, the oasis was dying. The well was yielding less and less water. 3 months ago, it was producing 200 liters per hour. Now it was 120. The water table was dropping. The oasis manager, an old man named Harold Watts, said that according to his calculations, there would be enough water for another 4 months. Maybe 5. Then it would all be over. 100 people without water in the desert. Second, Donovan was putting together his group. He walked around the oasis and talked to people, quietly, one at a time. Ethan didn't know what they were talking about, but he could tell that Donovan was looking at him differently. Not like a mechanic, like a problem. Third, Maddie found 3 solar panels on the motel roof, damaged, but with intact solar cells. She said that if she had 2 days and a soldering iron, she could assemble one working 200-watt panel from them. 200 watts isn't much, but it's light. It can charge batteries, maybe even power a small fan. Ethan listened, but he didn't see a panel. He saw a module, a power module, the first building block of something bigger. He began building the trailer on the 9th day. On the outskirts of the oasis, beyond the wall, lay the wreck of a Peterbilt truck. The cab had burned down, but the frame and the rear part of the casino were intact. Ethan walked around the truck for 2 hours looking it over. Then he sat down in the sand and drew with a stick. A workshop trailer. The truck's frame is cut down to 4 meters. A box made of sheet metal cut from the truck's body is mounted on top of it. Inside is a workbench, shelves for tools, a spot for a generator, Maddie's solar panel on the roof, a hitch for the old man's tow bar, a mobile workshop. Ethan looked at his drawing in the sand, and for the first time in a long while, felt not just the need to work, but the desire to do so. On the 10th day, he began cutting the Peterbilt frame. He didn't have an angle grinder, nor did he have enough electricity to power one. He cut with a hacksaw. He found 3 blades in the motel garage. The first one broke after an hour. The second one after an hour and a half. He saved the third one and cut more slowly. Maddie helped. She held the frame and handed him the tools. On the 11th day, a girl approached them. Young, Korean, petite, with a notebook in her hands. She stood there watching Ethan work, silently, for about 20 minutes. Then she came closer and showed him a drawing in her notebook. It was a blueprint of his trailer. But better, more precise, with dimensions, with angles marked, with the area calculated. Ethan took the notebook and looked at the drawing. Then he looked at the girl. He asked who she was. She said her name was So Ji-eun. You can call me Jeannie. She's an architect. More precisely, an architecture student. From Seoul. She'd been in this oasis for 3 months already. And in those 3 months, no one had built anything new. She said she couldn't just sit around anymore. Jeannie redesigned the trailer. Her design wasn't just prettier, it was more efficient. She suggested shifting the center of gravity closer to the wheel axle to reduce the load on the tow hitch. She drew a folding workbench that took up half the space when folded for transport. She added ventilation openings positioned to create a draft while in motion. Ethan listened and nodded. He was a mechanic. He knew how to make things work. Ginny knew how to make things work while also making them livable. That was the difference between a tool and a home. On the 12th day, a confrontation broke out. Ethan was under the truck, cutting off the last piece of the frame when he heard voices. Loud ones. He crawled out. 4 people were standing by the trailer, 3 men and a woman. He knew the men. They were Donovan's people. One of them said that Ethan was taking Oasis's resources, metal, tools, and cooling water, and that this was community property, not his personal workshop. Ethan listened. The man was right. Partially. The metal really didn't belong to Ethan. Neither did the tools. Ethan asked who else in the oasis could do something with this metal. Silence. He asked if anyone had a plan for how to get 100 people out of the oasis when the water ran out in 4 months. Silence. He said he was building a workshop trailer. That in this trailer, he'd be able to repair equipment. That working equipment meant evacuation, and evacuation meant life. Then he asked if any of them wanted to learn how to work with metal. One of the 3 men looked at the other 2. Then he said yes. He wanted to. His name was Marcus, a former construction worker from Riverside. He stayed and helped Ethan until the end of the day. On the 13th day, Hannah arrived. Ethan hadn't seen her among the Oasis residents before. She was tall. Her red hair was tied back in a bun. Her freckles had faded to a pale hue. She said she was a veterinarian. She explained that one of the people Ethan had rescued had a festering wound on his leg, and that she could treat it if they gave her some antiseptic. Ethan asked if there was any antiseptic at the Oasis. Hannah said they'd run out 2 weeks ago. Ethan thought for a minute. Then he asked if there was any alcohol at the Oasis. Hannah said that Harold kept 3 bottles of whiskey for special occasions. Ethan said that a festering wound was a special occasion. Hannah smiled. It was the first smile Ethan had seen at this oasis. She said she liked his logic. Then she left and returned an hour later with a bottle of whiskey and cleaned the wound. Hannah started coming to the van every evening. She brought Ethan a mug of what they called coffee at the oasis. In reality, it was boiling water with scorched barley grains. It tasted awful. Ethan drank it every time. Hannah would sit on a crate next to the old man and tell her story. She'd been driving from Montana to Arizona for a veterinary conference when it started. She got stranded. She survived. 3 months in Oasis. She talked about her dog Biscuit, who'd been left at the clinic in Helena. She didn't know if the dog was still alive. Most likely not. But she spoke of him in the present tense. Ethan listened and didn't correct her. He understood. Some things need to be spoken of in the present tense, even when it isn't true. Otherwise, they end forever. On the 14th day, the trailer was ready. 4 meters by 2. A steel box on a Peterbilt frame. A folding workbench based on Ginny's blueprint. Shelves with tools secured by straps so they wouldn't fall out while driving. Maddie's solar panel on the roof. A generator from a chainsaw found in the motel garage. Small, but enough for light and charging. Ethan hooked the trailer up to the old man's tow hitch. The van sagged on its rear springs. but it held. Ethan walked all the way around the entire setup. A van with a copper coil on the roof. A workshop trailer with a solar panel. This wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a platform, a mobile base, the beginning of something. The caravan left Oasis at dawn on the 16th day. 19 people. One van with a trailer. Two were walking alongside because there wasn't enough room in the van. Ethan was driving the old man. Maddie was sitting in the passenger seat, keeping an eye on the temperature gauge. Ginny sat at the workbench in the workshop trailer, drawing a route map in her notebook. Hannah rode in the cargo compartment of the van, among the canisters and boxes. The rest spread out between the van and the trailer as best they could. It was cramped. It was hot. It was uncomfortable, but they were moving. The first 30 miles went off without a hitch. I-15 was relatively clear. Sand had drifted onto the road in places, but not critically so. The old truck ran smoothly. The engine pulled the trailer without straining. The radiator coil was cooling effectively. Maddie checked the alternator voltage every 20 minutes and reported the readings. 14.2, 14.0, 13.8. Ethan nodded. Everything was normal. At the 35th mile, they saw a town. Or rather, what used to be a town. Baker. A small roadside town that, before the disaster, was known for one thing. A giant thermometer, the tallest in the world. 40 meters of steel structure jutting out of the ground like a needle. The thermometer was still standing, leaning to one side, with a shattered display, but it was still standing. The entire town was buried in sand up to the second story. Roofs jutted out of the sand dunes like gravestones. Ethan pulled the van over to the outskirts and said they'd spend the day there. The temperature was approaching 65. It was too dangerous to drive any further. He gave the crew 2 hours to rest. Then he took Marcus and headed into town. Baker was small, but to Ethan, it was a warehouse. Every building was a potential source of spare parts. Every garage was a potential source of tools. They checked 8 houses. In the first, there was nothing but sand and broken furniture. In the second, they found a can of motor oil, full. Ethan held it to his chest like a child. In the third, they found a set of socket wrenches in a plastic case, a complete set, ranging from 8 to 32 millimeters. Ethan stopped and stared at the case for a long time. Marcus asked what was wrong. Ethan said that a complete set of socket wrenches in working condition was now worth more than a gold bar. Marcus wasn't sure if it was a joke or not. It wasn't a joke. In the fourth house, they found a garage. The garage door was buried under sand, but Marcus broke through the side wall with the sledgehammer they'd found in the second house. Inside was a car. A 2004 Chevrolet Suburban, buried in sand up to the running boards. Ethan opened the hood. A 5.3 Vortec engine. It hadn't seized up. He checked it by hand. The crankshaft turned freely. There was oil in the pan, black as tar, but it was there. Ethan looked at the engine and did the math. The Suburban is a cargo platform, all-wheel drive, a large body. If the engine starts, it's a second vehicle. It's a place for people. It's a backup in case the old man breaks down. He returned to the RV. He told Maddie he'd found the Suburban. Maddie asked about its condition. Ethan said the engine turns over and there's oil. Maddie asked about the battery. Ethan said it was dead. Maddie nodded and walked over to the trailer. She returned 5 minutes later with a spare battery she'd taken from a UPS van in Oasis and carried with her just in case. Ethan looked at her. She said she was in the habit of stocking up on batteries. A professional habit. The two of them walked over to the garage. The Suburban started on the second try. The engine roared roughly but smoothly. Black smoke was coming out of the exhaust pipe. That's normal for an engine that's been sitting idle for more than half a year. Ethan let it warm up for 10 minutes. He listened. He sniffed. He placed his palm on the cylinder block and felt the vibration. Everything was fine. The second and fourth fuel injectors were slightly off timing. He could adjust them later. Maddie checked the electrical system. The alternator was working. The starter was fine. The heater, the fan, the headlights. Everything's working. She said it was an incredible stroke of luck. Ethan said it wasn't luck. It was the garage, an enclosed space. The sand and heat hadn't reached the engine. Someone had locked the garage before leaving. Maybe they hoped to come back. They didn't. They dug out the Suburban and pushed it onto the road. The tires were intact. The gas tank was half empty. Ethan poured engine oil from a canister they'd found into the engine. The oil level returned to normal. Marcus got behind the wheel. He knew how to drive. The Suburban could fit 8 people. The rest stayed in the van and the trailer. The caravan was now 2 vehicles. Ethan watched this and saw the next step. 2 cars, 1 trailer, 19 people. In a month, there would be 3 cars. In 2 months, 5. Every dead town on their route was a warehouse of spare parts. They left Baker in the evening when the temperature dropped to 40. The 2 vehicles drove in a convoy. The old man was in front with the trailer. The Suburban followed behind. They were traveling at 25 miles per hour. The trailer wouldn't go any faster. Ethan was driving and listening to the radio. Silence on all frequencies. Then a voice flickered in on shortwave. A snippet. 2 words. Then silence again. Ethan fiddled with the dial for 10 minutes. Nothing. But he'd heard it. Someone, somewhere, was broadcasting. They weren't alone. That night, the caravan stopped in the desert between Baker and the next town. The temperature was -4. People slept in their cars. Ethan didn't sleep. He sat outside by a fire made of dry brush and gazed at the stars. The sky, unmarred by city lights, was incredible. Millions of stars. The Milky Way like a white road stretching from horizon to horizon. Ethan looked toward the east. The map from the glove compartment lay on his lap. A D. Don't stop. East. He didn't know who had written it. He didn't know why. But something about those words drew him in, like a magnet in his chest. Hannah sat down next to him. She held out a mug of barley coffee. He took it. She said the children in the caravan were scared. 4 children. The youngest was 6. They didn't understand where they were going or why. Ethan asked what she suggested. Hannah said the children needed a routine, a schedule. Meals at the same time, sleep at the same time, activities. Ethan said he didn't know how to keep the kids occupied. Hannah said she didn't need his help with the kids. She needed his permission to organize a schedule for the entire caravan. Not just for the kids, for everyone. Ethan looked at her. She was right. 19 people can't live like a mob. They need structure. Not military style, as Donovan wanted. Human. He said yes. Let her organize it. Hannah nodded and left. Ethan drank his barley coffee and thought that Hannah saw what he didn't see. People. He sees machines and parts. She sees people and their needs. He needs to learn to see both. The next day, the caravan reached the Baker Inn, an abandoned motel at the intersection of 2 highways. 3 buildings, a swimming pool filled with sand, a parking lot for 30 cars. Of the 30 spaces, 7 were occupied. 7 cars. All dead. But to Ethan, they were 7 sets of spare parts. He stopped the caravan and announced a 2-day stop. He needed to service both cars and assess their resources. He spent the first day under the hoods. He serviced the old man. He tightened the alternator belt. He replaced the makeshift cloth air filter with a real one he found in the trunk of one of the abandoned cars in the parking lot. The size didn't match, but Ethan trimmed the housing with a knife. Then he moved on to the Suburban. He adjusted the fuel injectors. He replaced the oil filter. He checked the brakes. The rear brake pads were worn down. He removed the pads from one of the abandoned cars. The size was a perfect fit. That was truly a stroke of luck. On the second day, 2 things happened. In the morning, Ginny came to him with a new drawing. She had drawn up a plan for the caravan, not just a single van, but the entire caravan as a modular system. The living module, that's the van. Work module, that's the workshop trailer. Medical module. It doesn't exist yet, but a spot has been reserved for it. Water and food storage module. That doesn't exist yet either. She drew how the modules connect to each other when parked, how they disconnect when moving, how each module can function autonomously if the caravan splits up. Ethan looked at the diagram and saw his idea drawn by someone else's hand for the first time. He thought in terms of machines. Ginny thought in terms of a system. That was what he'd been missing. The second event happened in the evening. A column of dust appeared from the south. Someone was heading toward them. Fast. Ethan told everyone to go inside the buildings. He stayed by the van. Maddie stayed with him. Marcus, too. 20 minutes later, 3 motorcycles pulled up to the motel. 2 people on each. 6 of them. Wearing homemade armor made of road signs and pieces of plastic. Their faces were covered with cloth to protect against the sand. 2 of them had guns. One had a machete. They stopped 30 meters from the van and watched. For a long time. Then one of them, the one with the machete, removed the cloth from his face. A young man. Maybe 25. Tanned to the point of being black. He said they were from the Rattlesnake clan. That the territory from Baker to Prima belonged to the clan. That a toll was required to pass through. Water, or fuel, or women. Ethan listened. Then he asked what would happen if he didn't pay. The young man with the machete said they'd take it themselves. Ethan nodded. He looked at the motorcycles. 3 of them. Yamahas. 2-stroke. Old but well-maintained. Someone in the clan knew how to maintain the bikes. Ethan asked who fixed their motorcycles. The question was unexpected. The young man paused. Then he said it was Bruno, their mechanic. Ethan asked what would happen if Bruno couldn't work. The young man didn't answer. Ethan said he could hear the connecting rod knocking on the 3rd motorcycle. That in 500 miles, the connecting rod would punch through the crankcase and the engine would die. That Bruno most likely hears it too, but doesn't know how to fix it, because on Yamaha 2-stroke engines of this generation, the connecting rod bearing is press-fit, and replacing it requires a puller that Bruno surely doesn't have. The young man looked at him. For a long time. Then he asked how he knew. Ethan said he was a mechanic. The young man asked if Ethan could fix it. Ethan said he could, if he were given 20 liters of water in 2 hours. The young man turned to the others. They talked among themselves for a minute. Then the young man said that 20 liters was too much. 10. Ethan said 15. The young man said 12. Ethan said that for 12, he'd fix the connecting rod but wouldn't replace the oil seal, which was also leaking. 15 and he'd do both. The young man was silent for a moment. Then he said 15. On the 20th day, the caravan numbered 23 people. 4 had joined them in a small settlement of 3 houses by a dry riverbed. They heard the sound of an engine and came out onto the road. 2 men, a woman, a child of about 8. They were running out of water and had no transportation. Ethan didn't vote or ask for advice. He simply stopped and opened the door of the Suburban. Maddie looked at him but said nothing. Hannah sat the child down next to her and gave him some water. The child drank and looked at Hannah with wide eyes. Then he fell asleep on her lap. Hannah sat motionless for 2 hours so as not to wake him. The route went through what used to be Las Vegas. Ethan wanted to bypass the city from the north. Vegas was dangerous. The syndicate was there, those very water barons who controlled the water supplies and considered mobile caravans a threat. But the northern detour added 102 miles. 120 miles meant 4 days at their speed. 4 days meant water they didn't have. Ethan spread the map out on the old man's hood and calculated for a long time. Then he said they'd go through the southern outskirts of Vegas. Quickly. At night. Without lights. Maddie said that was madness. Ethan said that taking the detour meant dying of thirst. Maddie was silent for a moment and then said they'd have to get ready. It took 2 days to get ready. Ethan worked on the cars. He removed the muffler from one of the abandoned cars in the motel parking lot and installed it on the old man as the second in line. The dual muffler made the engine quieter. Not silent, but significantly quieter. The Suburban was more complicated. Its gas V8 roared like a bear. Ethan spent half a day assembling a 3-chamber system from 2 mufflers he'd found and a piece of corrugated pipe, which cut the noise in half. Maddie turned off all the lights in both cars except for one dim one on the dashboard, driving through the desert at night without headlights. Ethan said he'd navigate by the stars and the map. Maddie said he was crazy. Ethan agreed. Ginny did something else. She took the leftover tarpaulin and scraps of fabric and covered the van and trailer on the outside. The loosely hanging fabric blurred the vehicle's silhouettes in the dark. From a distance, the van looked like a shapeless mound rather than a vehicle. Ethan looked at the result and said that it was clever. Ginny blushed and said it was architecture. Camouflage is just architecture in reverse. Instead of making an object visible, you make it invisible. The same principles of form and contrast, only in reverse. They entered the Vegas area at 2 in the morning. The temperature was -3. The engines ran quietly. The headlights were off. Ethan navigated by memory and the stars. The former Las Vegas Strip lay to the left. Casinos jutted out of the sand like dinosaur skeletons. The neon signs had long since gone out, but the moonlight reflected off the remnants of glass and metal. The dead city glistened in the way like a pile of broken mirrors. Ethan didn't look. He listened. The engine, the road, the wind. And one more sound, distant. A low hum. Generators. Somewhere in downtown Vegas, generators were running. That meant people. Lots of people. Electricity. Organization. The syndicate. The convoy passed through the southern outskirts in 4 hours. Slowly. 10 miles per hour. Quieter. Darker. Ethan breathed through his nose and counted the intersections. He knew Vegas. He'd been here 3 times before the disaster. He used to go to the SEMA Auto Parts show every November. The streets had changed. The sand had reshaped the city. But the skeleton remained the same. He counted the turns and navigated using a street grid that existed only in his head. 3 hours in, the Suburban stalled. Marcus radioed in. They had 2 radios. Low-power ones, almost like kids' radios. They'd found them in one of the houses in Baker. Ethan stopped the old man and walked back. The Suburban stood as a dark mass in the middle of the street. Marcus said the engine had just cut out. Ethan opened the hood. He sniffed. He listened. Silence. He turned on his flashlight, shielding it with his palm so that the light fell only in a narrow beam onto the engine. The fuel pump. He pressed his ear against the gas tank. Silence. The pump wasn't working. The electric fuel pump in the Suburban's gas tank had died. Ethan stood in the darkness of a dead Vegas and thought, without the pump, fuel won't reach the engine. Replacing the pump here is impossible. He needed a new one, from another Suburban or a compatible vehicle. He'd have to search for it in the dark in a strange city near the syndicate's base. Maddie walked over and asked what was wrong. Ethan told her the pump was dead. Maddie thought for 30 seconds. Then she asked if fuel could be supplied by gravity. Ethan looked at her. Gravity feed? The Suburban's gas tank is under the body. The engine is higher up. Gravity feed won't work. But if we raise the tank above the engine, no, the tank is built into the frame. But we could make a temporary tank, a canister on the roof, a hose running down to the engine. Gravity instead of a pump. Ethan nodded. Maddie was already heading to the van to get the can and the hose. 20 minutes later, a can of gas was sitting on the Suburban's roof. The hose ran from the can through a slit in the hood directly to the fuel rail. Ethan bypassed the stock fuel line and connected the hose after the fuel pump. The gas flowed by gravity. Slowly. The pressure was lower than normal. The engine would sputter at high RPMs, but it would run at low RPMs. He told Marcus not to go over 2,000 RPMs. Marcus nodded. The Suburban started. Roughly. It sputtered, but it started. The convoy moved on. 1 hour left until they exited the Las Vegas area. Ethan was driving and silently praying that the gas cans would last. They did. At 5 in the morning, the convoy merged onto I-15 east of Vegas. The sky in the east was beginning to lighten, copper-colored, heavy, but with no syndicate lights behind them. They'd made it through. Ethan pulled the convoy over and got out of the cab. His legs were shaking. He hadn't noticed when they'd started. Maddie followed him out. She said her hands were shaking. Ethan showed her his. They were shaking too. They looked at each other, and Maddie laughed, quietly, nervously. Ethan laughed too. It was the first time they'd laughed together. In the morning, Ethan got serious about fixing the Suburban. The gas can on the roof was just a temporary fix. He needed a working fuel pump. He surveyed the surroundings. I-15 east of Vegas. Desert. No houses, no garages. But there was a tow truck parked on the shoulder. A big one. With a flatbed. The cab was covered in sand. Ethan walked over and took a look. A car was sitting on the tow truck's flatbed. Or rather, what was left of it. A Jeep Grand Cherokee. Burned out. The body was charred. But Ethan peered under the chassis. The gas tank was intact. A late 90s Jeep Grand Cherokee used a Bosch submersible fuel pump, compatible with a Suburban with minimal modification. Ethan was lying under the burned-out Jeep on the tow truck's flatbed in the middle of the desert, laughing. Marcus asked what was so funny. Ethan said the universe had delivered a replacement part to him right there on the tow truck. Just like home delivery. Replacing the pump took 4 hours. Ethan worked in the shade under the Suburban. Maddie helped with the electrical connections. The Jeep's pump was slightly longer. Ethan trimmed the housing and sealed the mounting ring with sealant. He connected it to the stock wiring. He turned the key. The pump hummed to life. Smooth. Clean. Gas flowed through the line. The engine started and ran like new. Maddie took the gas can off the roof and said it was elegant. Ethan said she was the first person he'd ever met who called replacing a fuel pump in the desert elegant. Maddie said she was an engineer. Engineers have their own standards of beauty. By evening on the 22nd day, the caravan set up camp 20 miles east of Vegas. Hannah organized dinner. Canned food. Leftover crackers. Water strictly rationed. 200 milliliters per person. The kids got 300. Ethan was sitting by the van, eating crackers. A woman from the new arrivals approached him, the one who joined them with her child by the dried-up river. She said her name was Teresa. She explained that her son, Lucas, hadn't spoken a word since the day they lost his father. 4 months of silence. She asked if there was anything Ethan could do. Ethan looked at her. He didn't know how to talk to children, especially traumatized children. He said he'd try. The next morning, he found Lucas. The boy was sitting in the back seat of the Suburban, staring out the window. Ethan opened the door and sat down next to him. He didn't say a word. He pulled a wrench out of his pocket and began twirling it between his fingers. Just like that, out of habit. Lucas watched the wrench. 10 minutes later, Ethan pulled out a second wrench, a small one, a 10. He placed it on the seat between them. Lucas didn't pick it up. Ethan got up and left. The next day, he sat down next to him again. He was twirling the wrench again. The same small 10mm wrench was lying on the seat. Lucas didn't touch it. On the third day, Ethan came over and saw that the 10mm wrench wasn't where he'd left it. A little closer to Lucas. Ethan sat down and started working with his hands. He'd brought a broken flashlight with him and was taking it apart. Lucas watched. 20 minutes later, Ethan held out the flashlight casing to the boy and showed him that he needed to unscrew one bolt. Lucas took the 10mm wrench and unscrewed it. He didn't say a word, but he did it. Ethan nodded and left. He came by every day. Every day he gave Lucas one small task. Unscrew. Tighten. Hold. Pass it over. Lucas didn't speak, but he did it. On the 7th day, the boy waited for Ethan by the van. He stood there with a 10mm wrench in his hand. Teresa watched from the window of the Suburban, covering her mouth with her hand. On the 25th day, they reached the point on the map that Ethan had marked as a waypoint. The intersection of 2 highways, I-15 and I-70. An interchange. There used to be a hub here. Gas stations, motels, stores. Everything was buried. But Ethan wasn't looking for buildings. He was looking for vehicles. There were trucks at the interchange. Long-haul trucks. 14 of them. Frozen in the sand like a herd of dead animals. The trailers were buried up to the roof. The cabs were sticking out. Ethan walked among them and knocked on the cabs. He peered into the engines. He checked the tires. 11 were hopelessly dead. 3 were potentially still running. One of them was a Kenworth T800 with a Cummins diesel engine. Ethan opened the hood and stood there for 5 minutes. A Cummins ISX, 15 liters, 600 horsepower. This engine could pull anything. A workshop trailer, a living quarters trailer, a tanker trailer, 3 trailers at once. If it would start. Ethan announced a 5-day stop. The caravan set up camp among the trucks. The kids played among the truck wheels. Hannah organized a medical checkup. Everyone, one by one. 2 were dehydrated. 1 man had been coughing for 3 weeks. Hannah examined him and told Ethan it looked like dust-induced bronchitis. He needed antibiotics. She didn't have any. Ethan said they'd find some. Somewhere. Somehow. Hannah looked at him with that look that meant she believed him, but knew he didn't know how. Ethan started working on the Kenworth. It wasn't a repair, it was an operation. The Cummins ISX was more complex than anything he'd worked on before. Electronic fuel injection, a variable geometry turbocharger, an exhaust gas recirculation system. Half of these systems depended on electronics that might not survive the heat and static electricity. Ethan started with the basics: oil, filters, hoses, belts. Then he dug deeper. He removed the turbocharger and inspected it. The impeller was intact. The bearings were dry but not damaged. He lubricated them with oil and put them back together. Injectors, 6 of them. He pulled them all out, flushed them with diesel. 4 were working, 2 were dead. He took the injectors from one of the dead trucks, a different model. They weren't directly compatible. Ethan spent a day adapting them. He reshaped the nozzle with a file. He adjusted the mounting surface. He installed them. On the 3rd day, Maddie figured out the electronics. The engine control unit was still working. She checked every contact. Half were oxidized. She cleaned them off. Sensors. 3 out of 12 were dead. Maddie found a way to trick the control unit. She soldered resistors in place of the dead sensors. The unit received fixed values instead of real ones. Not ideal. The engine wouldn't know the actual exhaust temperature or boost pressure. But it would start. Ethan said she was a genius. Maddie said she was an electrical engineer with a degree from Stanford. And that wasn't quite the same thing. Then she smiled. On the 4th day, the Kenworth started up. The roar of the Cummins diesel was different. Not like the old man. Deeper. More powerful. It was as if a beast had awakened, not an old man. The ground vibrated. The kids ran over to watch. Lucas stood next to Ethan, holding a 10mm wrench. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes were wide open. Ethan cut the engine and turned toward the trailer. 23 people stood in a semicircle, looking at him. He said that now they had a tractor-trailer, that the tractor-trailer could pull trailers, that the trailers were living modules, a workshop, a greenhouse, a medical unit, a water tanker. He said that from now on, they weren't just a group of people in 2 vehicles. They were a caravan, a real one, a mobile one, capable of moving and living at the same time. No one clapped, no one cheered, but Ethan saw their backs straighten. He saw their chins lift, how something had changed in the eyes of people who had lived like hunted animals for half a year. They saw the future. Let it be small, let it be fragile, but real. The caravan had been parked at the interchange for 5 days, and Ethan was already seeing it with different eyes. Not as a group of people in vehicles, but as an organism. The organism had organs. The old man was the heart. The Kenworth was the muscles. The workshop trailer was the brain. It lacked lungs. It lacked a stomach. It lacked skin. The lungs provided ventilation and cooling for the living modules. The stomach provided food. The skin is protection. Ethan sat on the roof of the Kenworth and looked at the 14 dead trucks around him, seeing not trucks but building materials. Each trailer is a wall. Each cab is a frame. Each axle is mobility. He climbed down and gathered the people. 23 people stood in the shade between the trucks. Ethan said they would stay here for another 7 days. That during those 7 days, they would build 2 modules, a living module and a water module. The living module is a trailer where they can sleep properly, not in their trucks. Lying flat. With a roof over their heads and walls that retain heat at night and reflect the heat during the day. The water module is a tanker on wheels, a 30-day supply of water for 23 people. He asked who wanted to help. 14 out of 23 raised their hands. Ethan nodded. He said they'd start tomorrow at dawn. Nari arrived at 5:30. Ethan was already at the Kenworth. He gave her her first assignment, to remove the wheels from 2 abandoned trailers, 8 wheels in total. No impact wrench, just A and an extension bar extension. Nari looked at the wheels. Each nut was tightened to a torque of 500 Newton meters. For a girl weighing 50 kilograms, this was physically at her limit. She asked if she could heat the nuts to loosen them. Ethan looked at her and, for the first time, felt that he hadn't made a mistake. The right question. Not how to remove them, but how to make removal easier. He said yes. There was no blowtorch, but they could use the sun, black paint, focusing. He showed her how to make a primitive solar concentrator out of a piece of mirror from a truck cab. Aim the reflected light at the nut. 10 minutes of heating. The metal expands. The nut loosens. Nari listened and took notes in her notebook. Then she got to work. By noon, she had removed 4 wheels. Her hands were shaking from the effort. She didn't complain. Meanwhile, Ethan was working on the living module. He chose one of the refrigerated trailers. The walls of the refrigerated trailer were insulated, sandwich panels with polyurethane foam inside. It was the perfect material. During the day, the insulation kept the heat out. At night, it kept the heat in. The trailer was long, 13 meters. Too long for their tractor trailer. Ethan decided to cut it down to 7 meters. Cutting sandwich panels with a hacksaw is a nightmare. Metal sheeting on the outside, polyurethane foam, metal sheeting on the inside. The hacksaw gets stuck in the foam. Marcus and 2 other men helped. They took turns cutting. 2 hours of work, an hour's break in the shade. 2 hours of work. By the end of the first day, they'd gotten through a third of it. Meanwhile, Ginny was designing the interior layout. 7 meters by 2.5. Height, 230. She divided the space into zones. A sleeping area with bunk-style shelves along the walls. 8 sleeping spots. A common area in the center with a folding table. A storage area at the end. She drew and redrew. She'd go over to Ethan and show him. Ethan looked and made adjustments. The shelves should be bolted, not welded, so they could be reconfigured. The table had to fold up against the wall, not down toward the floor, to free up workspace if needed. The door had to open outward, not inward, to save space. Jeannie nodded and adjusted the blueprints. They worked like the 2 hemispheres of a single brain. He thought in terms of function. She thought in terms of form. Together, they got it right. On the 3rd day of construction, a car pulled up to the intersection. Just one. A Toyota Tacoma pickup. Gray from the sand. A woman was behind the wheel. Short black hair, dark eyes, straight back. She got out and looked around. Her gaze settled on the Kenworth. Then at the trailer Ethan was cutting up. Then at Ethan. She walked over. She said her name was Sarah Flores, a former Phoenix police officer. She'd been driving alone for 3 weeks, looking for a trailer. Anyone. She'd heard from people at a watering hole 60 miles to the south that there was a group at the junction with working equipment. Mechanic. She said the word as if it were a proper noun. Ethan realized that word had gotten out about the rattlesnake lean. Sarah surveyed the camp. Silently. Slowly. Like a cop surveying a crime scene. Then she said 3 things. First, the caravan has no security, no guard posts, no patrols, no alarm system. Second, children are playing unsupervised among the trucks, and one of them has climbed onto the roof of a semi. A fall from there would be fatal. Third, the caravan has no weapons at all except for Marcus's hunting rifle with 7 rounds. Ethan listened and realized she was right. He built machines. He didn't build security. He asked what she was proposing. Sarah said she would stay, if he'd accept her. She would organize security, checkpoints, patrols, and order. Ethan asked what she needed. Sarah set a place in the caravan and a task. Ethan said, "You're welcome." Sarah got to work right away. By evening, there were 2 observation posts near the camp, on the roofs of 2 trucks on opposite sides of the interchange. She made sunshades for the lookouts out of sheet metal. She drew up a duty roster, 4 6-hour shifts, 2 people per shift. She went around to every adult and asked who knew how to shoot. 4 people could. Marcus, a man named Dan, a former hunter from Nevada, a woman named Patricia, a former National Park Ranger, and Maddie. Maddie surprised everyone. She said her father had been a Marine and had taught her to shoot when she was 12. Sarah nodded and assigned Maddie to the night shift. Maddie didn't object. On the 4th day, the living module had been cut down to 7 meters, and Ethan began assembling the interior. 2 tiered shelves made from truck seat frames. Mattresses made from foam found in the cabs. Thin but better than a metal floor. A folding table made from the door of one of the trucks. Hinges made from seat belts. Ginny kept a close eye on every measurement. She stood there with a tape measure, making sure the distance between the shelves was exactly 70 centimeters. No more because that would waste space. No less because a person wouldn't be able to turn over in their sleep. Ethan asked how she knew the minimum dimensions for a sleeping space. Ginny said it was from her introductory ergonomics course in the 2nd semester. Then she quietly added that she never thought she'd apply it this way. On the evening of the fourth day, Hannah came to Ethan with a problem. The man with bronchitis had taken a turn for the worse. His temperature was 39. He was coughing up blood. Hannah said that without antibiotics, he'd die within a week, maybe sooner. Ethan asked where they could find antibiotics. Hannah said the closest option was a pharmacy. Anyone. In any of the snow-covered towns. The problem was that pharmacies were the first places to get looted. But there was a chance. Veterinary clinics. They were looted less often because people didn't know that antibiotics for animals and humans are often the same. Amoxicillin is amoxicillin. It doesn't matter if the package says it's for people or for dogs. Ethan looked at Hannah. She knew this because she was a veterinarian. She said the nearest town with a veterinary clinic was Mesquite, 40 miles to the northeast. Ethan said he'd go in the morning. Sarah said she'd go with him. Ethan said there was no need. Sarah said he wasn't going alone to an unfamiliar town 40 miles away without backup. It wasn't up for discussion. Ethan looked at her. She looked back at him, calmly, firmly, like someone who was used to having the final say on safety matters. Ethan nodded. They set out at dawn in Sarah's pickup truck, a Toyota Tacoma. A 4-cylinder engine, fuel-efficient, quiet. Sarah was driving. Ethan watched the road in the map. Not the map from the glove compartment marked RH, another one. A road map. An ordinary one. But he was thinking about the first one. Don't stop. East. They were heading northeast. Almost east. Mesquite was dead. A small town in the Mojave Desert. Before the disaster, maybe 15,000 people lived here. Now no one. The houses were buried. The streets were buried. But the town was small, and the sand here was thinner than in Vegas. The first floors were accessible if you dug. Ethan and Sarah found a veterinary clinic on the 3rd Street off the main road. A sign with the silhouettes of a cat and a dog stuck out of the sand. It took them an hour to dig out the door. Inside, it was dark and smelled like what happens when organic matter decomposes and then dries out. Sarah turned on her flashlight. The reception area. Empty cages. A desk with a computer covered in dust. Ethan walked into the back room. The operating room. A medicine cabinet. The door was open. Half the shelves were empty. Someone had been here before them. But they hadn't taken everything. There were vials on the bottom shelf. Ethan read the labels. Amoxicillin, 250 milligrams, 12 vials. Metronidazole, 8 vials. Dexamethasone, 4 ampules. Syringes, bandages, surgical sutures. Ethan packed everything into his backpack and felt his hands trembling. Not from fear, from relief. The man with bronchitis would live. On the way back, Sarah was silent for a long time. Then she spoke. She asked why he was doing this. Not for the antibiotics. Everything. The caravan, the modules, the people. Ethan thought for a moment. Then he said he didn't know how else to do it. He was a mechanic. He fixed what was broken. People were broken. The world was broken. He fixed them. Sarah was silent for a moment. Then she said her husband used to say something similar. He'd been a police officer. He'd said he couldn't just walk by. That it physically hurt to walk by when someone is in trouble. He died on the first day of the disaster. He was trying to get people out of the mall when the roof started melting. Their daughter, Eve, was 6. She was with her husband. Sarah fell silent and didn't speak again until they reached the camp. Ethan didn't break the silence. Some things shouldn't be commented on. You can only listen. The second month in the desert began with a sandstorm. Not the great storm, just an ordinary one, a local one. But for a caravan traveling on an open highway, even an ordinary storm was a disaster. The wind picked up in 20 minutes. The temperature dropped by 15 degrees. Visibility was reduced to 3 meters. The sand pelted the metal like buckshot. Ethan stopped the caravan and ordered everyone inside the modules. Shut down the engines. Close the windows. Plug the cracks with rags. Wait, the storm lasted 9 hours. Inside the living module, 24 people sat in the dark, listening to the sand screeching against the walls. The children were crying. Diesel whimpered and pressed himself against Hannah's legs. The temperature inside the module rose to 42. The insulation from the sandwich panels worked both ways. During the day, it kept the heat out. but it also trapped body heat. 24 people in a confined space are like 24 heaters. Ethan opened the ventilation vents, but sand blew in through them. He closed them and stretched a piece of cloth over the openings as a filter. The air started flowing, slowly, but the temperature stopped rising. Maddie sat next to Ethan by the wall. She said quietly that she hated enclosed spaces. Ethan asked why. She paused and said that when the disaster began, speaking in a bunker with her brother, a bunker beneath a startup's office. 20 people. The generator ran for 3 weeks. Then she couldn't fix it. The ventilation shut down. They sat in the dark without air for 4 days before someone managed to open the door. 7 didn't make it. Her younger brother, Kevin, didn't make it. He was 23, a programmer. He wrote his first line of code when he was 8. She said the generator broke down because a bearing overheated. The bearing could have been replaced. She knew how, but she didn't have a puller. She knew exactly what kind of puller was needed, the exact size. But it wasn't in the bunker. Her brother died because there wasn't a piece of metal of the right shape in the room. Ethan listened and said nothing. He knew words wouldn't help here. He sat beside her and remained silent. A minute later, Maddie rested her head on his shoulder. Not romantic, tired. Like someone who'd held their head up for too long. Ethan didn't move. He sat like that until the storm was over. When they went outside, the world had changed. The sand had reshaped the landscape. The road was gone. Landmarks were gone. The old truck was buried up to the door. The Kenworth was buried up to the cab step. The trailers were sunk in the sand up to a third of the way up their wheels. Ethan walked around the vehicles. No damage. But getting out of the sand wouldn't be easy. The wheels were sinking. He needed a solid surface under the wheels. Then he remembered. Ramps. In overlanding culture, people use plastic ramps. They place them under the wheels in the sand. He didn't have any plastic ramps, but there were 14 abandoned trucks at the interchange behind him. Or rather, there weren't anymore. They'd left. But there was something else around. Ethan looked around. I-70 heading east. To the right of the road, the tops of poles were sticking out of the sand. Road signs. He walked over and dug one up. A sheet of aluminum. 1 meter by 1 meter 20. Sturdy, lightweight. The perfect ramp. He dug up 4 signs. He placed them under the Kenworth's wheels. The tractor pulled out. Then he moved the ramps under the old man's truck. Then under the Suburban. Then under Sarah's pickup. The process took 4 hours. Every 20 meters, he had to pull out the ramps and reposition them. 20 meters of progress per cycle. But they were moving. Marcus asked if they couldn't just drive around on solid ground. Ethan said there was no solid ground in this area. It's all sand, especially after the storm. But in 10 miles, the rocky desert would begin. It would be easier there. They just had to get through those 10 miles. Marcus looked at the sign ramps and said nothing. Nari was working alongside Ethan. She was hauling the signs with him. They were heavy, awkward. The sharp edges cut into her hands. Nari wrapped rags around her palms and kept going. She didn't complain, but Ethan could tell she was angry. She wasn't angry at the sand or the signs. She was angry at herself. She wanted to find a better solution, faster, more efficient. Ethan told her that sometimes the only solution is hard, mindless work. That not every problem can be solved elegantly. Nari looked at him and said he sounded like her drill sergeant in the Korean army. Ethan asked if that was a compliment or not. Nari said she hated her drill sergeant. But he was right, always. By evening, the caravan had traveled 10 miles and reached rocky ground. The wheels stopped sinking. Their speed increased to 20 miles per hour. Ethan felt physically relieved. It was as if someone had taken the backpack off his shoulders. But the relief didn't last long. On the horizon, he saw smoke. Not sandy, black, thick. Someone was burning something. Or someone was on fire. Ethan stopped the convoy and took out his binoculars. He'd found them in the cab of one of the trucks at the interchange. One lens was cracked, but the other was enough. He looked at the smoke. It was coming from a cluster of buildings 5 miles away. Little oasis, or what was left of oasis. The buildings were on fire, or had recently been on fire. The smoke was already thinning. Sarah walked over and took the binoculars. She looked through them. She said it was an attack, the work of the Rattlesnake clan. They burned down settlements that refused to pay. Ethan asked how she knew. Sarah said she'd seen this happen twice on the way from Phoenix. The settlement refuses to pay. The clan arrives at night, burns the supplies, takes the water, leaves. They usually don't harm the people. Why waste bullets when the desert will do the job? Ethan stared at the smoke and thought. Then he said they'd go there. Sarah said it was dangerous. Ethan said that if there were survivors there, they needed help. Sarah looked at him for a long time. Then she said okay, but she'd go first. They pulled up to the settlement an hour later. The clan was gone. They'd left. The settlement was small, 5 cinder block buildings, a water tower made of welded barrels. The tower was riddled with holes. The water had leaked out into the sand. A dark stain on the ground was already drying up. 3 buildings had burned down. 2 were still standing. Inside one of the surviving buildings, Ethan found people. 8 people. An old man, 2 middle-aged women, a man with a burned face, and 4 children. The youngest was about 5. The oldest was 12. A girl. Her right leg was swollen, an open fracture. The bone was sticking out of the skin below her knee. There was redness and swelling around the wound. An infection was setting in. Ethan looked at the girl and then at Hannah. Hannah was already kneeling nearby, examining the leg. Her face was calm, professionally calm. She said it was an open fracture, that the bone was displaced, that if it wasn't stabilized and disinfected, the girl would lose her leg. Or her life. Ethan asked what was needed. Hannah said they had antibiotics. They had disinfectant. They had suture material. She needed an external fixator, a device to stabilize the bone from the outside, with pins through the bone and a metal frame. Ethan nodded and went to the workshop. 3 hours. He worked for 3 hours without a break. Maddie held the light. Nari handed him the tools. Ethan took apart a motorcycle shock absorber. He pulled out the rod. Chrome-plated steel. Smooth. Strong. From the rod, he cut 4 spokes, each 10 centimeters long. He sharpened the ends on a whetstone. From a piece of steel pipe 20 millimeters in diameter, he made the frame for the clamp. 2 half rings, connected by threaded studs. The studs were made from bolts. The threads were cut with a die found in the workshop. The spokes were attached to the frame with wing nuts, so the tension could be adjusted without tools. When he finished, the device looked rough, homemade, but the principle was sound. He showed it to Hannah. She examined every component and checked the rigidity. She checked the travel of the pins. She nodded. The procedure lasted 2 hours. The temperature in the building was 55. Hannah worked in latex gloves she'd found at a veterinary clinic. She inserted the pins through the bone. 4 pins, above and below the fracture. She secured them to the splint frame. She set the bone. The girl was under the influence of dexamethasone and local anesthesia from veterinary lidocaine. She didn't scream, but her eyes were open, and she stared at Hannah without looking away. Hannah spoke to her, quietly, calmly. She about Montana, about the mountains and the snow, about bears that steal honey. The girl listened and breathed. 2 hours later, her leg was in the splint. Hannah administered an antibiotic injection. She cleaned the wound. She covered it with a sterile bandage. Then she went outside and sat down on the ground. Ethan came over. She said everything was fine, that the girl would keep her leg. Then she added that this was the first time she'd operated on a person instead of an animal. Ethan said she'd done a great job. Hannah looked at him and said it was thanks to his device. Without the splint, she wouldn't have been able to do it. Ethan said they were just tubes and bolts. Hannah said no, they weren't just tubes and bolts. They were a hand holding the bone in place while it healed. The caravan traveled 60 miles east, and every mile tested its strength. On the second day of the journey, a leaf spring on the living module snapped. The trailer became lopsided. The left side sagged 12 centimeters. As they drove, the module swayed, and the people inside could neither stand nor sleep. Ethan stopped the caravan. He inspected the suspension. The leaf spring had cracked right down the middle. Cast iron. Old. Worn out from the load. It needed replacing, but there were no spare springs. Ethan thought about it for 20 minutes. Then he went to the Suburban. He removed a spring from it. The Suburban sagged on one side. Ethan placed a wooden block under the sagging side of the Suburban, between the frame and the axle. Rough. Temporary. But the Suburban could drive. He moved the spring from the Suburban to the living module. It was a different size. In short, stiffer. But Ethan added a spacer made of steel strip, and the suspension leveled out. 2 hours of work. The caravan moved on. On the third day, Nari asked a question that changed her learning experience. She asked why Ethan was repairing things instead of rebuilding them from scratch. Ethan didn't understand. Nari explained. The leaf spring had broken. He swapped in a spring from another vehicle. But you can forge a new one. Out of steel. Heat it. Bend it. Harden it. Ethan looked at her and said that forging a spring requires a temperature of 900 degrees. They don't have a furnace. No anvil. No coal. Nari said they have the sun. 68 degrees during the day. That's not 900. But if you concentrate it... Ethan paused. A solar concentrator. He'd shown Nari a small one for heating nuts. But if you scaled it up... A parabolic mirror. A focal point. If you gathered enough reflective surface area, you could reach a temperature of up to 1,000 degrees at the focal point. Theoretically. Ethan told Nari that this would be her project, a solar forge. If she could build it, she'd be able to forge metal. And if she could forge metal, the caravan would no longer have to rely on found spare parts they found. Nari didn't answer. She took out her notebook and began calculating the area of the reflective surface needed to reach forging temperature. Ethan watched and felt something akin to pride. On the fourth day, they found a cross marked on the map. The place looked like nothing special. A flat desert. Rocks. Sand. No buildings. No landmarks. Ethan checked the map 3 times. The coordinates matched. VS 40. A water well at 40 meters. But there was no sign of water. He got out of the car and looked around. Then he dropped to his knees and pressed his palm against the ground. Warm. Just like everywhere else. He picked up a rock and tapped the ground. Then he moved a meter away and tapped again. And again. And again. On the 15th tap, the sound changed. Deeper. Softer. There wasn't rock beneath the stone. Clay. Moist clay deep underground. Ethan dug. With his bare hands at first. Then with a shovel from the workshop trailer. After half a meter, the soil became damp. After a meter, water began to seep from the side of the hole. Murky. Clay-laden. But water. The caravan stopped for 3 days. Ethan dug a well. Not a real one. He had nothing to drill a real one with. He made a well. A pit 2 by 2 meters, 4 meters deep. He reinforced the walls with sheet metal so they wouldn't collapse. Water collected slowly at the bottom. 1 liter per hour, 24 liters per day. Not enough. 32 people need at least 250 liters. But the well could be dug deeper. Ethan kept digging. At 6 meters, the flow increased to 5 liters per hour. At 8 meters, it was 10. Digging any deeper without shoring up the walls was dangerous. The walls could collapse and bury him. Ethan decided to take the risk. Marcus went down with him. They took turns digging. One dug, the other hauled up the soil in buckets on a rope. At 10 meters, the flow reached 20 liters per hour. 480 liters a day. Enough. With plenty to spare. RH's map hadn't lied. Whoever drew it up knew where to find water beneath the desert. Ethan stood by the well and watched as Hannah filtered the water through a triple layer of cloth and boiled it over the campfire. The children drank and laughed. Lily sat in the shade with her leg in a brace and smiled. Her first smile since the attack. Ethan took out the map and unfolded it. He looked more closely. There were 7 more crosses on the map. 7 potential water sources. Scattered along the route to the east. Someone had charted a path through the desert from spring to spring. Someone knew this route. RH knew it. Ethan put the map away and set to work on what he did best. Construction. He made the most of the 3 days he'd spent at the well. The living module needed some finishing touches. The ventilation wasn't working well. It got too hot inside during the day. Ginny suggested a solution, a double roof. An outer layer of metal, supported by spacers 10 centimeters above the main roof. The sun heats the outer layer. The hot air rises through the gap and escapes. The main roof remains in the shade. The temperature inside drops by 10 degrees. Ethan listened and nodded. The principle is well known. It has been used in the traditional architecture of desert regions for thousands of years. A double roof, spacers, shade. Jeannie knew this from her textbook. Ethan knew it from experience. His grandfather had installed a double roof on the garage in Barstow. He said it kept the tools from overheating. They built the double roof in a day. The result exceeded expectations. The temperature inside the module dropped from 52 to 41. It was still hot, but bearable. People could sleep during the day. That was critical. The caravan traveled at night and at dawn. During the day, everyone slept, except for the lookouts. And Ethan. Ethan slept 4 hours a day. Maddie told him he'd kill himself.
Ethan said he'd catch up on sleep once he got there.
Maddie asked where. Ethan said east. Maddie looked at him and said that wasn't an answer. Ethan remained silent. On the 6th day, a group approached the caravan at the well. 5 people, 3 women, 2 men. They had been walking from a settlement 40 miles to the south. The settlement was dying. The well had dried up. They had seen the caravan's tracks in the sand and had been following them for 2 days. One of the men was carrying the other on his back. The other man had a broken leg, not an open fracture but a closed one. Still, he couldn't walk. Ethan met them at the well. He gave them water. He fed them. Hannah examined the leg. She applied a splint made of sticks and bandages. Sarah checked them for weapons. They were unarmed. Ethan didn't call a council meeting. He simply showed them a vacant spot in the living module. 37 people. The 3rd month. The caravan was moving east at a speed of 30 miles a day. 37 people. 4 vehicles. 3 trailers. 1 dog named Diesel. The route went from cross to cross on the RH map. Each cross turned out to be a water source. Not always a good one.
The second well yielded water with such a high iron content that it stained the teeth black. The third provided clean, cold water at a depth of just 3 meters. The 4th turned out to be dry. The aquifer had run dry. It was a reminder that the map was drawn long ago and the land changes. Nari built a solar furnace. Not perfect, but it worked. She assembled a parabolic mirror from 12 pieces of mirror glass from car. She mounted it on a frame made of bent steel strip. The mirror's diameter was 80 centimeters. The focal length was 30. At the focal point, the temperature reached 700 degrees. Not 900, but enough for annealing and bending mild steel. Nari demonstrated it to Ethan. She placed the steel strip at the focal point. After 4 minutes, the strip was red hot. Nari picked it up with pliers and bent it on an anvil made from a piece of railroad track. Ethan watched. The strip bent evenly. Nari looked at him, waiting for his reaction. Ethan said the bend angle was 3 degrees more than necessary. Nari opened her mouth to object. Then she looked at the strip. She measured it. 3 degrees. Exactly. She looked at Ethan and called him unbearable. Ethan said he was precise.
Nari said it was the same thing. The solar forge changed everything. The caravan was no longer dependent on spare parts found in the ruins. Nari forged springs, brackets, hinges, fasteners, simple parts but each one used to require a search through dead cities. Now Nari made them from any scrap of steel. Ethan taught her heat treatment, heating, quenching in oil, tempering. Each stage changes the metal's properties. Too hard it will be brittle, too soft and it won't hold its shape. Nari listened and practiced. Within a week, she was forging spring plates that could bear a load of 1 metric ton. Ethan inspected each one, silently. If a part passed inspection, he put it in a box. If not, he returned it to Nari. No comments. Nari got angry. She would redo it. Bring it back again. Ethan would inspect it. Put it in the box. Nari soon realized that silent acceptance was the highest praise. Words were unnecessary. By the 4th month, the caravan had grown to 42 people. People came from the desert, one by one, in pairs and in families. Word of the caravan with working equipment and water spread faster than they traveled. Ethan accepted everyone.
Maddie stopped arguing. She realized it was pointless to argue with him about this.
Instead, she solved the problem another way. She built a second power unit, solar panels. 3 of them, assembled from fragments found in various places. Total capacity, 400 watts. That was enough to charge all the caravan's batteries, for light in the evening, for the fans in the living module, for radio communication. Maddie named the power unit. She gave it a name, Power Unit Chen Jr., in honor of Kevin, her brother. Ethan saw the inscription painted on the casing and said nothing, but he understood, and Maddie knew he understood. On the 120th day, a clash occurred with the Rattlesnake Clan. Not a small group on motorcycles like the first time, a full-fledged unit, 12 vehicles, pickup trucks, SUVs, one armored van with a machine gun on the roof, 40 people. They were waiting for the convoy at a narrow pass between two rocky ridges, an ambush. Sarah was the first to spot them. She had been driving ahead in her pickup truck on a reconnaissance mission. She returned and reported that the pass was blocked. Ethan stopped the caravan 2 miles from the ambush. He called a meeting. Maddie, Sarah, Hannah, Marcus, Ron, Neri, Ginny. 8 people. Sarah said there were 40 of them, and they had a machine gun. A head-on attack would be suicide. A detour was impossible. Cliffs on both sides. Retreat, possible. But where? Ethan remained silent while everyone spoke. Then he asked Marcus how much fuel they had. Marcus said the Old Man and the Kenworth ran on diesel. The Old Man's tank was full. The Kenworth was 3/4 full. The Suburban ran on gas, half a tank. Sarah's pickup had a full tank. Ethan nodded. Then he asked Nari how much used engine oil she had. Nari said about 40 liters in canisters. They'd drained it during the oil change but hadn't thrown it away, because Ethan had said never to throw anything away. Ethan said, "Good." Then he turned to Maddie and asked if she could assemble a remote-controlled electrical ignition system in 6 hours. Maddie looked at him. Then she said she could, if he explained why. Ethan explained. 6 hours. Night. The caravan stood in the darkness, lights off. Ethan worked. Maddie worked. Nari handed him tools. The plan was simple in concept but complex to execute. Ethan modified the exhaust systems of the Old Man and the Kenworth. He installed a diesel burner nozzle on each exhaust pipe. The nozzles were connected to cans of used oil. On command, the oil was injected into the red-hot exhaust tract and instantly. The result? A cloud of hot oil smoke, thick, black, and impenetrable to the eye. The smoke's temperature is about 200 degrees. It's impossible to breathe in it, impossible to see, impossible to shoot. The 5th month. A group of 8 people approached the caravan. Ragged, scorched. Among them were a 12-year-old girl, an elderly couple, a young man with burns covering half his face, 3 adult women, and a boy of about 7. They had nothing. No water, no transportation, no food. They had been walking for 4 days from a destroyed settlement that the clan had burned down just like the first one. Ethan stopped the caravan. He looked the people over. He turned to the council. The council gathered at the Kenworth. Ethan, Maddie, Sarah, Hannah, Marcus, Ron, Nari, Ginny, 8 people. Ron ran the numbers. The caravan currently had 42 people. 8 new ones brings the total to 50. As of now, there's enough water for 12 days for 42 people. For 50, it'll last 10 days. The next marked spot on the RH map is 80 miles away. A 3-day journey. If the spring turns out to be dry like the 4th one, the next one after that is 120 miles away. A week. We'll run out of water before then. Ron said all this in the even tone of an accountant stating facts rather than passing judgment. Marcus said not to let them through. Ron said not to let them through. Ginny was silent. Nari was silent. Hannah said to let them through. Sarah said to let them in. Maddie said they needed to think it over. Ethan was silent. Everyone waited. He said he'd put it to a vote. 4 in favor. 2 against. 2 abstained. Ethan voted in favor. 5 in favor. 2 against. 2 abstained. The group was accepted. 50 people. Marcus shook his head and walked over to the Suburban. Ron jotted down the numbers in his notebook and went to recalculate the quotas. But that night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the workshop thinking not about water. He was thinking about the girl. From the new group. She was 12-teen. Like Lily. She didn't have a fracture. She had a burn on her right forearm, an old one. It had healed crookedly. The skin was pulled tight by a scar. The fingers of her right hand wouldn't straighten completely.
Hannah examined her and said the tendons had shortened because of the scar. She needed surgery or physical therapy. Neither was available in the desert. The girl's name was Ava. She didn't complain about her hand. She complained that she couldn't draw. She wanted to draw. Her right hand wouldn't obey her. Ethan thought about it for 2 days. Then he went to Hannah and showed her what he'd made. An exoskeleton for her hand. Not electric, mechanical. A steel wire frame that mimicked the shape of her fingers. Springs from clock mechanisms found in one of the ghost towns. A system of levers that helped her fingers extend, like a brace, but customized for the specific hand of this specific child. Hannah placed the exoskeleton on Ava's hand. Her fingers straightened. Not all the way, but enough to hold a pencil. Ava picked up the pencil and drew a line. A crooked one, a wobbly one, but a line. She looked at Ethan. He nodded and walked away. Ava watched him go, gripping the pencil so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The next day, Ethan met Olivia Prescott. Not in person, over the radio. Maddie had tuned in a shortwave transmitter they'd assembled from parts of 2 car radios and an antenna made of copper wire stretched between the Kenworth's roof and a mast made of aluminum pipe. Under good atmospheric conditions, the range was up to 300 miles. Maddie scanned the frequencies every evening. That night she picked up a signal. Clear. Strong. A woman's voice. Monotonous. It was transmitting data. Wind speed. Temperature. Humidity. Pressure. Direction and speed of air masses. Forecast. In 14 months, a continent-wide sandstorm will sweep across the territory from Southern California to Kansas. Wind speeds up to 300 kilometers per hour. It will last between 9 and 15 days. Permanent settlements below 50 meters will be buried. This is the Great Storm. Maddie called Ethan. He listened for 20 minutes. Then he picked up the microphone and came on the air. He identified himself. He said he was leading a caravan eastward. The voice fell silent. Then it asked where he'd gotten a working radio. Ethan said he'd put it together himself. The voice was silent for another 10 seconds. Then it identified itself. Olivia Prescott, climatologist. Hoover Dam Oasis. She'd been broadcasting the forecast every night for 5 months. No one had responded. Ethan was the first. She asked how many people he had with him. He said 50. She paused. Then she said there were 400 at Hoover Dam. That the Oasis leadership didn't believe in the storm. That they thought she was crazy. That she was broadcasting the forecast because there was nothing else she could do. Ethan said he believed her. Olivia was silent for a long time. Then she gave the coordinates. The meeting place. 600 miles to the east, a spot on the Colorado River where the dam still holds back the reservoir. She said that if he made it there, she had the data he needed. A complete model of the storm. Detour routes. Safe zones. Ethan said he'd make it. Olivia said she hoped so. The connection was lost. Ethan stood in the workshop with the microphone in his hand, staring at the wall. 700 miles. At 30 miles a day, that's 20 days. 20 days if nothing breaks down. If no one attacks. If the water doesn't run out. If. He hung up the microphone and walked over to the old man. He got into the cab. He put his hands on the steering wheel. He said quietly that 600 miles was a long way, even for them. The old man didn't answer, but the engine was still warm from the evening's work, and the metal of the steering wheel felt like someone's palm. Ethan closed his eyes. 5 seconds. Then he opened them and went to plan the route. The next 3 weeks were the hardest. The convoy drove non-stop for longer than just overnight. Ethan pushed the truck hard. 30 miles a day turned into 35, then 40. The truck was taking a beating. The Kenworth started overheating. The turbine whistled at high RPMs. Ethan could tell by the sound that the turbine bearing was wearing out. He had maybe 200 miles left before it failed. He ordered Nari to forge a spare shaft. Nari said that the turbine shaft was a precision part. The tolerance was in the hundredths of a millimeter. She couldn't achieve that level of precision under field conditions. Ethan said he could. He explained that the tolerance could be met by lapping the shaft's surface after forging it, using a paste of fine sand and oil. He showed her how. 3 hours of manual lapping. The shaft came out with a tolerance of 3/100ths of a millimeter. Nari measured it and looked at Ethan as if he were a man from another time. And he was from another time,
a time when hands replaced machines. On the 12th day of the trek to Hoover, Maddie did something that changed the caravan forever. She set up a communication system between the caravan's modules, an intercom, wired, with a cable running from vehicle to vehicle through the trailers. Each module received a communication device, a speaker and microphone from car stereos. Now Ethan could talk to Sarah in the pickup from the Kenworth's cab. Hannah could call the workshop from the living module. Nari could contact Marcus in the Suburban from the workshop. The caravan became a single organism, not a collection of vehicles, but a system. Maddie connected the last module and on the line. She said, "Communication check." Everyone responded. One by one, voices from each module. Maddie stood there with her headphones on listening. 50 voices, alive, connected. She took off her headphones and looked at Ethan. He was standing 10 meters away looking at her. She didn't smile, neither did he, but something between them changed in that moment. The wire stretched between their modules was more than just a cable. On the 18th day, they saw the dam. Hoover Dam, a concrete arch in the Colorado River Canyon. Ethan stopped the Kenworth at the edge of the cliff and got out. The dam stood there, cracked, with its upper tier crumbling away. But it stood. Behind it was the reservoir, not full, maybe a third full, but water, real water, open, glistening in the sun. The children climbed out of the modules and stood in silence. Some of them had never seen so much water in one place. Hannah stood there, tears streaming down her face. She didn't wipe them away. Diesel barked at the water. Olivia was waiting for them at the base of the dam. Tall, thin, her hair was silvery, even though she was 34. Her face was impassive. Her eyes were gray and calm, like those of a person who had seen the end of the world in numbers long before it came to pass. She looked at the caravan. 50 people. 4 vehicles, 3 trailers, solar panels, and a copper coil on the roof of the old man. Then she looked at Ethan. She said she'd been expecting 1 vehicle. Ethan said he had 2. Olivia led them to the Hoover Dam Oasis. 400 people, concrete rooms inside the dam, electricity from the surviving generators, cold water, food from hydroponic farms. By desert standards, it was paradise. The Oasis leadership greeted the caravan with caution. 50 new mouths to feed. Ethan didn't ask for refuge. He offered a trade, repair skills for water and supplies. The Oasis manager, a man named Garrett Walsh, a former hydraulic engineer, looked at Ethan with interest. The 6th month. The caravan was heading east through the territory that, before the catastrophe, had been called Arizona. Now it was simply a desert. No borders, no states, no names. Sand and rock stretching to the horizon in every direction. 51 people, 4 trucks, 3 trailers, 1 dog. Olivia sat in the Kenworth cab and took readings every 2 hours. Temperature, humidity, pressure, wind direction. She jotted down the numbers in a notebook in small handwriting. Ethan asked why, since the forecast had already been made. Olivia said that a forecast is a model. A model works as long as it matches reality. If reality starts to diverge from the model, it means the storm will come sooner, or later, or stronger. She needs to know. Ethan nodded. He understood. A mechanic checks the engine even when it's running fine. That's exactly when he checks it. On the 3rd day of the 6th month, Ethan noticed that Lucas was standing by the Kenworth, touching a wheel. The boy hadn't spoken in 5 months, but he was fiddling with the machinery, stroking the metal as if it were a living creature. Ethan walked over and crouched down beside him. He asked if Lucas wanted to look at the engine. Lucas didn't answer, but he followed him. Ethan opened the Kenworth's hood. A 15-liter Cummins ISX. Huge, black with oil and dust. Ethan began to talk, not to Lucas, to the engine. He spoke to the Cummins as if it were alive. He called it a big guy. He pointed to the turbocharger and said it was breathing for the engine. He pointed to the fuel injectors and said they were its mouth. He pointed to the oil pump and said that it was its heart. Lucas listened. The next day he came back, and the next. On the 4th day, Lucas pointed at the alternator and looked at Ethan. Ethan said that it was the alternator, that it made electricity. Lucas nodded. It was his first gesture of communication in 5 months. Teresa stood 10 meters away, covering her face with her hands. On the 10th day of the 6th month, the caravan approached a place Olivia called the Glass Valley. Ethan pulled the Kenworth over to the edge and got out. A basin lay ahead. A wide one. Maybe 15 miles across. The bottom of the basin glistened. Not like water. Like glass. Because it was glass. The sand had melted. According to Olivia's calculations, the temperature at the bottom of the depression reached 120 degrees. The scorching air rose in waves. Even at the edge, the heat was palpable, like that from an open furnace. Olivia said that going around the glass valley would add 150 miles to the journey. A direct route through it would be 30. But the temperature would destroy any engine in 20 minutes. The tires would melt. The metal would glow red hot. People would be cooked alive. Ethan stared at the glass valley for 2 hours. He didn't speak. He was thinking. Then he turned to Maddie and asked what the temperature was at the bottom at night. Olivia answered for her. At night, the temperature at the bottom drops to 45. The glass gives off heat quickly. But 45 is still the limit for the tires. And the road is made of glass. Slippery. Unpredictable. Maddie said it was suicide. Ethan said a 150-mile detour meant 5 days. 5 days was the bare minimum of water they had. He was choosing between risk and guaranteed shortage. He chose risk. 2 days of preparation. Ethan worked on the cooling system for each vehicle. The old man already had a coil. Ethan added a second circuit. He removed the radiator from one of the wrecked trucks they found at the edge of the basin and installed it as an additional heat exchanger. The Kenworth got a modified system. Ethan wrapped the exhaust pipe in asbestos cloth he found in the construction debris. This reduced heat transfer from the exhaust into the engine compartment. He and Nari fitted homemade heat shields to all the wheels on all the vehicles. Aluminum discs cut from body panels were secured over the tires. They reflected heat away from the road surface. Not completely, but enough. Maddie did her part. She assembled a temperature monitoring system for each vehicle. Thermocouples made from dissimilar wires, copper and iron. When heated, a potential difference is created. A voltmeter displays the temperature, primitive but accurate. She placed the sensors on the tires and on the engines, on the undersides of the vehicles. She ran the wires into the cabs. Each driver could see the temperature in real time. If a tire overheated, the driver would know before it burst. The convoy entered the glass valley at 2 in the morning. The surface temperature was 43 degrees. The vehicles moved slowly, 10 miles per hour. The glass beneath the wheels crunched and screeched. The headlights reflected off the glass floor, creating the illusion that they were driving across a frozen lake. The children were asleep in the living module. The adults were awake. Maddie sat in the Kenworth cab and read the thermocouple readings. Tires, 62. Engine, 91. Underbody, 54. She called out the numbers aloud. Ethan listened and adjusted the speed. At the 8th mile, the ice grew thinner and sand began to show through. The vehicles moved more easily. At the 12th mile, the ice disappeared, and they were back on normal ground. The temperature dropped to 38. Ethan felt his shoulders relax. But he didn't stop. There were still 18 miles to the edge of the valley. They covered those 18 miles in 2 hours. At dawn, the caravan emerged on the other side of the glass valley. Behind them, the glass surface was beginning to heat up in the first rays of the sun. Maddie said the surface temperature was already 70 Tuesday. If they'd lingered for an hour, the wheels would have melted. Ethan nodded. They didn't linger. That's what matters. The 7th month. The convoy regrouped and continued eastward. The trailers were lost. The workshop, living module, water tank. Half a year's worth of work left behind in the canyon for the syndicate. Ethan stood by the Kenworth and took stock of what remained. 4 trucks, 51 people, 4 days' worth of water. Only the tools that had been in the trucks. Maddie's solar panels on the roof of the old man. Hannah's medical supplies in her. The clothes on their backs. Everything else was gone. Nari walked over and stood beside him. She was silent for a minute. Then she said it was her fault. That they could have left the trailers behind. That they could have just driven away faster. Ethan looked at her. He said the trailers were slowing down the Kenworth. That the syndicate would have caught up with it in an hour. That she'd made the right decision. The only one. Nari stared at the sand. Ethan said the trailers were just metal and wood. They could be rebuilt. They can't be rebuilt. Nari raised her head. Her eyes were glistening, but she wasn't crying. She said she'd start designing new trailers. Better than the old ones. Ethan said he was counting on it. Construction began anew. Not from scratch. The experience remained. The workers were still there. The knowledge was still there. A week later, the caravan stumbled upon a railroad station. It was buried in sand, but the tracks jutted out of the sand and led to the depot. Two freight cars stood in the depot, steel boxes on wheels. Ethan looked at them and saw trailers. A freight car is a ready-made structure. Walls, a roof, a floor, doors. All they had to do was mount them on a car axle instead of a railroad bogie. Ethan cut a 6-meter section out of the frame of one car. Nari forged adapter brackets for the truck axles. Maddie moved the solar panels onto the roof of the new module. 5 days later, the caravan had a new workshop trailer. Rougher than the previous one. Heavier, but sturdier. The walls made of railroad car steel could stop a bullet. Ginny was working on the second rail car, the living module. She completely remodeled the interior. Not like the first time, better. 6 months of living in the caravan had taught her what they don't teach in college. That people need personal space, even if it's just 30 square centimeters behind a curtain. That children should sleep separately from adults, because children have a different rhythm. That you need a place where you can sit and stare silently at the wall, because sometimes that's the only way not to go crazy. She divided the car into 3 zones: the sleeping area, the common area, and the quiet zone. In the quiet zone, there was 1 chair and 1 window, nothing else. Ethan looked at the quiet zone and asked why there was empty space when room was so scarce. Ginny said that empty space isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. A person who can't be alone breaks down. Ethan fell silent. He thought about himself, about the nights in the old man's cabin when he'd sit alone and gaze at the stars. That had been his quiet zone. He nodded and didn't argue any further. Year 1. The caravan crossed what used to be Texas and entered Louisiana. The landscape changed. The sand became less frequent, dried-up trees appeared, skeletons of forests. White, barkless trunks jutted out of the ground like bones. The daytime temperature dropped to 55. By desert standards, it was almost cool. Olivia said this was due to the influence of the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf had evaporated to 2/3, but what remained still affected the climate. The humidity rose to 12%. For people who had lived at 4% for half a year, the air felt almost damp. The caravan had grown. Not gradually, all at once. In Texas, they'd met 3 groups, one of 12 people, another of 7, a third of 21. The third group was a caravan, a small one. 2 trucks, no trailers, no mechanic. Their vehicles were falling apart. Ethan proposed joining forces. The leader of the second caravan, a woman named Rosa Martinez, a former teacher from Dallas, agreed. The caravan grew to 94 people, 7 vehicles, 4 trailers. Ethan looked at the column of vehicles stretching a quarter of a mile and realized that this was no longer a caravan. It was a settlement on wheels. With growth came problems. There wasn't enough water. There wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough space. People from different groups didn't trust each other. Rosa's caravan was used to different rules. They voted on every decision, by majority. Ethan made decisions with a council of 8. This created friction. Rosa said that every adult should have a vote. Ethan said that 94 people couldn't vote on every turn of the wheel. Maddie proposed a compromise. The council would expand to 12. 4 new seats for Rosa's people. Voting on major issues. Operational decisions would be up to Ethan and Sarah. Rosa agreed. The 9th month brought Ginny what she'd been waiting for half a year. Maddie had upgraded the shortwave transmitter. Its power had tripled. The range was now up to 800 miles. Every night, Ginny scanned the Korean frequencies. Silence. 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 And then, in the 3rd week of the 9th month, a voice. Korean. A man's voice. A broadcast from Incheon Oasis. Ginny grabbed her headphones and pressed them to her ears. She listened for 20 minutes. Then she began speaking into the microphone. In Korean. Quickly. Her voice trembled. Maddie didn't understand a word, but she could see Jeannie's face. Ethan stood at the workshop entrance and watched. Jeannie spoke for 5 minutes. Then she fell silent. She listened.
Then she covered her face with her hands and doubled over. Maddie rushed over to her. Ginny raised her head. She wasn't crying. She was trying to, but she couldn't. She said one word, in English. Alive. Ethan left the workshop and left them alone. He went over to the old man. He got into the cab. He looked at the steering wheel. He thought about his mother. Helen. She's somewhere out east. Maybe she's alive. Maybe not. He took out his father's letter and reread it for the 100th time. Find Helen. She knows how to turn it off. Turn off what? The catastrophe. The machine that caused the catastrophe. The vacuum energy device that someone had activated without a shutdown circuit. Ethan wasn't a physicist, but he was an engineer. He understood that every machine has an off switch, and every switch is a mechanism. And he knew how to fix mechanisms. In the 10th month, the caravan reached the Mississippi. The river was there. Not at full flow. Narrow. Murky. But it was flowing. Olivia said that groundwater fed the river. Not all year round, seasonally. Now was the season. In 3 months, the riverbed would dry up again. But right now, there was water. The caravan stopped on the bank for 2 weeks. People washed themselves for the first time in months. Hannah stood knee-deep in the water and didn't move for an hour. The children splashed around. Diesel swam. Ethan didn't go in the water. He stood on the bank and counted. 94 people. 1,000 miles to the point of climatic stabilization. 6 months until the Great Storm. 1,000 miles in 6 months. It seems like a long time. But Ethan knew that any day could bring a breakdown, an attack, a storm, illness. 1,000 miles across a dead world is no distance at all. It's a probability. On the banks of the Mississippi, Ethan began building something that changed the game. A school trailer made from a second freight car. Inside were workbenches, tools, a chalkboard made from a sheet of metal, and chalk made from natural limestone. He gathered a group of young people, 8 of them, ranging in age from 16 to 25. Nari was among them, but no longer as a student, as an instructor's assistant. Ethan taught the basics of engines, cooling systems, electrical work, welding, forging. 4 hours every day. Theory in the morning, practice in the evening. He explained a turbocharger to Grandma from Rose's trailer using the metaphor of baking bread. Air is forced into the cylinder just as dough is pressed into a mold. The denser it is, the more powerful the explosion. Just like yeast. Grandma nodded and said she understood now. Nari stood nearby and jotted down the metaphor in her notebook. She said she'd include it in the textbook. Ethan asked which textbook. Nari said she was writing a mechanics textbook for future caravans, for those who would come after them. Ethan looked at her and, for the first time, thought of the future not as a direction on a map, but as the people who would live after him. 2 weeks later, on the banks of the Mississippi, a car pulled up to the caravan. Just one. An old pickup truck. Behind the wheel sat a man in his 60s, gray-haired, thin, with a military bearing. He got out and asked who the mechanic was. Ethan stepped forward. The man introduced himself. His name was Donovan. Ethan looked at the man who had left him for dead by a broken-down van on the shoulder of I-15 10 months ago. Donovan had aged 10 years. His eyes were sunken. His cheeks were hollow. He said that the oasis along I-15 had come to an end. The water ran out 3 months ago. People had left. Most headed south. You went east, following the caravan's trail. Following the rumors. Mechanic. He'd heard that word everywhere. He'd been walking for 4 months, alone. He said he didn't need a spot in the caravan. He needed to say one thing. He said he'd been wrong. That the order to abandon the van had been a mistake. That Ethan knew it, but he didn't. That the people he'd left behind on the highway would still be alive if he'd listened to Ethan. He fell silent. Ethan looked at him. Then he said, "Sit down, have some food." Donovan stood there, motionless. Ethan repeated, "Sit down, have some food. There's room." Donovan sat down. He ate in silence. Then he fell asleep by the campfire. Ethan covered him with a blanket and went to see the old man. Some things don't need to be discussed. It's enough just to do them. 1 year and 2 months. The caravan was moving through the former states of Mississippi and Alabama.
For the first time on the entire journey, Ethan saw clouds. Not dust in the air, real clouds. White, thin, high in the copper sky. Olivia said they were harbingers. The great storm is forming in the west. Its breath is changing the atmosphere for thousands of miles.
The clouds are condensation from the moisture the storm is drawing from what remains of the ocean. In 4 months, these clouds will become a black wall, stretching from horizon to horizon. Ethan listened and kept driving. The caravan consisted of 112 people, 8 vehicles, 5 trailers, including the medical module that Hannah had set up in the bed of one of Rosa's caravan trucks, including the greenhouse trailer. Hydroponics made from plastic pipes, lettuce, radishes, greens. Hannah tended to the plants as if they were patients. She checked the water's pH. She controlled the lighting using Maddie's solar panels. The first harvest was small, 3 kilograms of greens. For 112 people, that was nothing. But when Hannah handed out a leaf of lettuce to each person, they chewed slowly, closing their eyes. The taste of fresh greens after a year of crackers and canned food was like a taste from another world. In the 3rd week, Ethan picked up a radio signal, not from Olivia, not from Incheon. Another one. Weak, on a frequency he hadn't been scanning. Maddie picked it up by accident. A woman's voice, repeating a single phrase. A beacon. Coordinates. And 3 words. The squelch is active. Ethan heard it, and his hands stopped above the workbench. The squelch. Words from his father's letter. Helen has the cancellation circuit. He grabbed the microphone. He identified himself. Silence. He called out again. He said he was Ethan Rice, Robert Rice's son. The silence lasted 30 seconds. Then a voice answered. The voice said one name. Ethan. Then it fell silent. Then again. Ethan. It's you. The voice trembled. It was his mother's voice. Helen Rice was alive. She was in a bunker on the grounds of a former military base in Georgia, 400 miles from the caravan's current location. She had been working on the vacuum energy project for 28 years. After her husband's death, she went underground. The military took her away, a secret project. She knew a catastrophe would happen. She tried to prevent it. She didn't make it in time. The device was launched without a suppression circuit because those who launched it didn't know the circuit was necessary. Robert knew. Helen knew. But Robert died, and Helen was locked in a bunker. She built the suppression circuit. Alone. Over 25 years. But the circuit cannot be activated remotely. It must be delivered to the Cascade Resonance Point, a point on the East Coast, formerly known as Savannah. There stands a device that is destroying the world, and the suppression circuit that can stop it lies in a bunker in Georgia, waiting for someone who can deliver it. Ethan listened and said nothing. Maddie stood nearby. Sarah stood in the workshop doorway. Hannah stood behind her. When Helen finished speaking, Ethan said he'd come. Helen said the journey was dangerous. The area around the bunker was controlled by a group guarding the device, not because they knew what it did, but because it provided them with electricity. The vacuum energy device generated enormous power. The group had tapped into it and was using it to power their oasis. They didn't know that the device is killing the planet. Or maybe they do know and they don't care. Helen said she tried to explain. They kicked her out. She went into the bunker and built the suppression circuit all by herself. Ethan said he'd come. Helen said she'd been waiting 28 years. Then the connection was lost. Atmospheric interference. Eddie said she'd restore it in a few hours. Ethan nodded. He walked out of the workshop and sat down on the ground next to the old man. He placed his palm on the hood. The metal was warm. He said quietly that he'd found her. The old man. He'd found Mom. Maddie came out after him and sat down beside him. She didn't say a word. She just sat there. A minute later, she placed her hand on top of his, on the old man's hood. Ethan didn't move his hand. They sat like that for 10 minutes. Then Ethan stood up and said they needed to plan their route. The next month was a race. The great storm was approaching. Olivia provided updates every day. The front was forming. Its speed of spread was increasing. The initial 14-month forecast had turned out to be optimistic.
The storm would arrive in 3 months, maybe sooner. The stabilization point, Helen's bunker, and Savannah. 3 points. A triangle on the map. The caravan must pass through all 3. Pick up Helen. Retrieve the suppression circuit. Reach Savannah. Deactivate the device. And make it to the stabilization point before the storm hits. Or it's all for nothing. 1 year and 5 months. Ethan's caravan was parked by the bunker in Georgia. A steel door in the hillside. A dead forest all around. White trees like a palisade. The silence was so thick you could hear the sand crunching under your feet. Ethan stood in front of the door and didn't go in. Maddie stood behind him. Sarah stood by the Humvee 20 meters away, rifle at the ready. Hannah held Diesel by the collar. Nari stood by the Kenworth and didn't move. Ginny was sketching in her notebook. Olivia was counting down the minutes until the storm. According to her latest data, 14 days. Maybe 12. The door opened from the inside. A woman stood in the doorway. Short, thin, shoulder-length gray hair, hands covered in calluses and welding burns. Green eyes, just like Ethan's. She looked at him and didn't move. Ethan looked at his mother, whom he hadn't seen in 8 years and whom he'd believed to be dead. He didn't rush toward her. She didn't rush toward him. They stood 3 meters apart and looked at each other. Then Helen said he looked like his father. Ethan said that's what people had told him. Helen said he had Robert's hands. Ethan looked at his hands. Then he said he'd brought the van. Helen looked over his shoulder. She saw the old man. Her expression changed. She pressed her palm to her lips. Then she lowered it. She said that this van was supposed to have been buried along with Robert. Ethan said that the old man hadn't agreed. Helen led them into the bunker. A military facility. Concrete, steel walls, a diesel generator. 3 years' worth of fuel reserves. She had lived here alone. For 25 years, she had been working on the suppression circuit. The device lay on a table in the central room. A cylinder, 1 meter long, 30 centimeters in diameter. Copper windings. A steel casing. Electromagnets. A cooling system made of copper tubes. Ethan looked at it and saw the engineering. Beautiful, precise, handcrafted. 25 years of one person's handiwork. He reached out and touched the casing. Cold, smooth. The welds were perfect. He looked at his mother. She was a mechanic, like him, like his father. It was in his blood. Helen explained. The vacuum energy device stands in a former research center in Savannah. It has been running continuously since it was launched 30 years ago. It extracts energy from the vacuum of space. A side effect. Cascading resonance. Vibration at the subatomic level. It heats up the atmosphere, evaporates water, turns the planet into a desert. The process is accelerating. The Great Storm isn't a storm. It's a planet trying to shed excess energy, like an engine that overheats and explodes. The damping circuit suppresses the resonance. It needs to be installed on the device and activated. The process is irreversible. The device will shut down permanently. The electricity it provides to the group in the savannah will disappear. But the destruction of the planet will also stop. The atmosphere will begin to return to normal. Not immediately. It will take years, maybe decades. But the process will begin. Ethan asked one thing. He asked if it could be done. Not theoretically, practically, physically. To transport the cylinder to the savannah, install it on the device, activate it, in 12 days, through territory controlled by an armed group. Helen said it was impossible to do alone. Ethan looked at her and said he wasn't alone. Loading took an hour. They installed the suppression circuit in the workshop trailer, secured it with straps. Maddie connected the power from the Kenworth generator. The circuit required pre-cooling. 12 hours at a temperature below 10 degrees. The old man's copper coil, the very same system Ethan had assembled on the first night from the refrigerator's cooling unit. It was now cooling the device that was supposed to save the world. Ethan looked at the coil and shook his head. A refrigerator. It all started with a refrigerator. Helen got into the old man's cab. In the passenger seat. She rested her hand on the dashboard and said nothing. Ethan got behind the wheel. He started the engine. The old man came to life. Hoarse. Familiar. Alive. Helen closed her eyes and listened. She said that Robert loved that sound, that he used to say every engine has a voice. Ethan said he thought so too. Helen opened her eyes and looked at her son. She said he didn't just resemble his father, he was his very embodiment. Ethan shifted into gear and pulled the old man out onto the road. The caravan set off toward the savannah. 200 miles in 10 days. The last 2 weeks of peace. Olivia was counting the days. The storm front was visible to the west, a dark band on the horizon, growing larger, drawing closer every day. The wind was picking up. The temperature was fluctuating wildly, 62 by day, -8 at night. The extreme swings were brutal. The metal expanded and contracted. Bolts were loosening. Welds were cracking. Ethan and Nari worked every night, tightening, checking, repairing. Maddie kept an eye on the electrical system. Wires were bursting from the voltage swings. She soldered and insulated. The caravan creaked and groaned, but it kept moving. On the 8th day, they saw Savannah. The city was still standing, not completely buried. Partially. Buildings jutted out of the sand, 2 or 3 stories high. In the center of the city, there was a glow. Light. Electric. Bright. A vacuum energy device was supplying electricity to an entire neighborhood. A group was living there. Ethan stopped the caravan 5 miles away and took out his binoculars. Walls. Watchtowers. Guard posts. Serious defenses. Helen said there were about 300 of them, well armed. Ethan lowered his binoculars and thought, an assault is impossible. Negotiations are pointless. They won't shut down the device that provides them with electricity. Ethan thought for a full day. Then he laid out a plan. No assault. No negotiations. A swap. The shutdown circuit needs to be installed on the device. The device is located in the basement of the research center. The group uses the upper floors. They only go down to the basement for maintenance. Once a week. The next maintenance is in 2 days. Ethan will go in as a mechanic, someone who fixes things. The group needs mechanics. Everyone needs mechanics. He'll offer his services, fix something, earn access, go down to the basement, install the circuit, and activate it. Sarah said it was crazy.
Maddie said it was the only plan. Helen said the device activates in 4 minutes.
4 minutes between setting up the circuit and complete shutdown. 4 minutes in the basement of a guarded building. Ethan said that 4 minutes is 240 seconds. He used to replace piston rings in 300. 4 minutes will be enough. He entered Savannah alone, on foot, unarmed, with a toolbox in one hand, the suppression circuit in a backpack on his back. It weighed 20 kilograms. He was stopped at a checkpoint. 2 men with assault rifles. Ethan said he was a mechanic, that he'd heard they had electricity, which meant they had a generator. That generators break down and he could fix it. They searched him. They found the tools. The backpack. They asked what was in the cylinder. Ethan said it was a filter. For the generator's cooling system. Homemade. They let him inside. The leader of the group was a man named Cole, a former soldier, smart, tough. He looked at Ethan and asked where he was from. Ethan said from the west. Cole asked what he could fix. Ethan said, anything that moves, and half of what doesn't. Cole didn't smile, but his eyes grew more attentive. He said their ventilation on the 2nd floor hadn't been working for a month. Ethan said, show me. He fixed the ventilation in an hour, a clogged air duct and a burned-out fan motor. He rewound the motor on the spot. Cole stood there watching. Then he said they had a week's worth of work. Ethan said 2 days would be enough. On the 2nd day, he was allowed into the basement. Cole led the way himself. The device stood in the center of a concrete room, a cylindrical chamber 2 meters high. It was humming, a low, vibrating hum that was felt not with the ears but in the bones. Ethan looked at the device and saw what his father had described in the blueprints. Electromagnets, a resonance chamber, a cooling system, and the connection point for the damping circuit. Standard, as intended by the design. His father had built it into the device from the very bad. He knew it would be needed. He just didn't have time. Cole went upstairs. He left one guard behind. Ethan took out his tools and began to work. He told the guard he was checking the cooling system. The guard nodded and turned away. Ethan opened his backpack. He took out the damping circuit. His hands didn't tremble. 20,000 hours of hands-on experience with metal, 10 years of rescue operations. He could feel every bolt by touch. He connected the circuit to the standard connection point, 4 fasteners, 8 bolts, the power connector, copper contacts. He tightened each bolt to the correct torque. He could feel with his hands when it was enough. Then he activated it. A toggle switch. 1. A click. The hum changed. It grew higher, then lower. Then it began to fade, like an engine being silenced. Ethan stood there and listened. The light in the basement flickered. The security guard turned around. He asked what was going on. Ethan said it was routine maintenance. Everything was fine. The security guard looked at him, then at the device. The hum was fading. The electromagnets were losing power. The security guard grabbed his radio. Ethan didn't move. 4 minutes. He was counting. 120 seconds. 150. The guard was shouting into the radio. There was movement upstairs. 200 seconds. 210. The basement door burst open. Cole, with a gun. He was looking at the device that was falling silent. At the jamming circuit connected to the standard power point. At Ethan. 230 seconds. Cole aimed his gun. Ethan stood motionless. 235. Cole asked, "What did you do?" 238. Ethan told the truth. He said he'd turned off the machine that was killing the planet. 240. The hum stopped. Completely. Silence filled the basement like water fills an empty vessel. The device stopped. The lights went out. The entire savannah was plunged into darkness. Cole stood with a gun in his hand in total darkness, breathing heavily. Ethan stood across from him and waited. 5 seconds. 10. Cole didn't shoot. He lowered the gun. He said into the darkness that there was no more electricity. Ethan said he could put together a generator, solar panels, a wind turbine, anything. You can generate electricity without a device that's burning up the world. Cole was silent for a minute. Then he turned on his flashlight. He looked at Ethan. He said it was true, that the device was killing the planet. Ethan said yes. Cole was silent for another half-minute. Then he put the gun away. He said, "Go build your generator." Ethan left the research center at dawn. The caravan was waiting 5 miles away. Maddie was the first to see him. She was standing on the roof of the Kenworth with binoculars and saw a figure walking down the road from the city. She recognized him by his gait. She climbed down from the roof and ran. It was the first time in a year that Maddie had run. She stopped 3 steps away from him. He stopped. She asked, "Did it work?" He said, "Yes." She stood there looking at him. Then she walked over and took his hand. Not just his palm, his whole hand, with both of her hands. She told him he was an unbearable idiot and that she wouldn't let him go. Ethan said he still needed to pull the 17mm socket out of his pocket. Maddie laughed. Quietly. Just like that night when they drove through Vegas. Only now it wasn't a nervous laugh. It was real. The great storm came 11 days later. The caravan was heading for the stabilization point. 340 people. 4 caravans met along the way. Ethan's caravan. The caravan from Tennessee. The caravan from Carolina. And a 4th one they weren't expecting. Nari's caravan. She'd left with 12 people 3 weeks earlier. Ethan had sent her off. He'd given her a Suburban and told her she was now her own boss. Nari had cried and screamed that he'd kicked her out. Then she'd hugged him and driven off to build her own road. And here she is. 12 people had become 28. She had her own workshop trailer, her own solar horn, her own manual. Ethan looked at her from the cab of the Kenworth and nodded. Nari nodded back. 26 modules. 340 people. 11 days in a sandstorm storm. 0 visibility. Temperatures ranging from -10 at night to 70 during the day. The electronics failed on the first day. Maddie worked non-stop. On the 8th day, her main power unit failed. The Chen Jr. power unit. That very one. The one she'd named after her brother. Ethan worked for 6 hours at -5 with his bare hands. Gloves made it hard to feel the threads. His fingers turned blue. Maddie held the flashlight and kept him from falling asleep. She talked to him. Not about the wires, about herself, about her brother, about how she felt.
For the first time, she spoke to him not as an engineer to a mechanic, but as one person to another. Ethan listened and worked. The power unit came back to life. Maddie took his hands and warmed them with hers. 10 minutes, in silence. His fingers began to feel again. On the 11th day, the caravan emerged from the storm. Ahead lay what no one had believed possible: a green oasis. A real one. Grass. Trees. A river. Clouds. White. Low-lying. Olivia's climatic stabilization point. The collision of air masses had created a microclimate. The storm had bypassed this place. It had brought rain instead of destruction, water instead of sand. The caravan came to a stop. People stepped out of the modules and stood there, in silence. The children touched the grass. Some of them had never seen grass before. They sat on the ground and stroked the green blades with their palms. Hannah stood knee-deep in the river and cried. Not like she did in Mississippi. Deeper. Quieter. Diesel lay on the grass and didn't move. He just lay there. Lily was walking without a brace. The bone had healed. She ran through the grass and laughed. Lucas stood next to Ethan, holding a 10mm wrench. He turned to Ethan and said one word. Beautiful. His first word in 8 months. Teresa stood 10 meters away, crying with her hands covering her face. Ava was drawing, with her right hand, in the exoskeleton Ethan had made. She was drawing grass, a river, people, a caravan, a van with a copper coil on the roof. Jeannie stood nearby and was drawing too. 2 artists, one with a notebook, the other with an exoskeleton. Olivia sat on the hill and looked up at the sky. Clouds. Real ones. She took out her notebook and wrote, Model confirmed. Stabilization point exists. Microclimate is stable. Then she closed her notebook and lay down on the grass. She looked up at the sky and breathed. Helen stood by the old man and stroked the hood. She said quietly that Robert would be proud. Ethan stood next to his mother and said nothing. Sarah pulled up in the Humvee. She got out and stood on the grass in boots that had walked only on sand for a year. She looked at the Humvee's dashboard. 3 names. Then she closed the door and walked toward the river. She wasn't crying. She was smiling. For the first time in over 2 years. Maddie walked over to Ethan. Silently. She took his hand. She didn't let go. He didn't pull away. They stood there and watched the 340 people who were touching the grass and drinking clean water and laughing and crying all at once. Ethan took the gloves out of his pocket. Those very ones. The leather ones. Worn. With a scorched palm. The ones he'd worn when he pulled the girl out of the burning car. The ones he'd used to pry open the old man's engine on the first night. He hung them on the van's rearview mirror. A 10mm wrench was already hanging next to them. Lucas had hung it there. Ethan hadn't noticed when. He turned toward the caravan, toward the people, toward the team. He told them to rest. We're here for a week. Then we're heading east. Maddie asked why east. It's all over after all. The device is turned off. The storm will pass. Ethan shook his head. He said there were still people, everywhere. All over the country, all over the world. People who don't know the catastrophe has been stopped. People who are waiting and dying. They need caravans. They need mechanics. They need the road. 12 caravans. 40,000 people. This isn't the end. It's the beginning. He looked toward the horizon. Far to the east, a single dot was moving, faint but distinct. Then 2. Then 3. The silhouettes of vehicles. A caravan. Another one. It was heading toward them. Someone else had heard the radio. Someone else had survived. Someone else was still on the move. Maddie squeezed his hand tighter. Ethan squeezed back. The old man stood behind them, warm, alive, with gloves on the rearview mirror and a copper coil on the roof. The engine was silent, but it was ready. Ethan Rice, 29 years old, a mechanic, not a hero, not a warrior, not a prophet. A man with hands and a head who is restoring humanity to the world. Nut by nut.